Hey there, history lovers. Tonight we meet a guy who invented being nosy for a living. No sword, no crown, no army. Just one curious Greek named Herodotus, and a single word he could not stop asking. Why? Why do people go to war, and can you trace a feud all the way back to where it actually started? So he walked across the whole known world to find out. Lydia, Babylon, Egypt, the wild steppes of Scythia. What he brought back was pure chaos. Piles of gold, royal betrayals, doomed love stories, and kings who really should have read the room. This series runs through his greatest hits, from a secret that started in one bedroom to the battle that decided the future of Europe. Basically, this man collected more drama than a whole season of reality TV, and then wrote it down so we could argue about it today. Now do me a favour and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from, and what time it is for you right now. Ready? Let's roll. So let's meet the man himself before we meet his cast of doomed kings, because honestly, he's just as interesting as any of them. Picture a coastal town called Halicarnassus, a sun-baked Greek port clinging to the edge of what is now southwestern Turkey. This is where our curious friend was born, somewhere around 484 BC, give or take a few years, since nobody back then was filling out birth certificates. It was a comfortable start. His family was wealthy, well-connected and educated, which in that era meant they could actually read, owned scrolls, and probably bored dinner guests with poetry. Not the worst hand to be dealt. There was just one small complication. Halicarnassus was technically Greek in culture, but politically it sat under the thumb of the Persian Empire, the largest superpower the world had ever seen up to that point. So Herodotus grew up as a Greek boy living inside a Persian-controlled town, which gave him something most historians would kill for, a front-row seat to two civilizations at once. He could see how the Greeks thought, and he could see how their enormous eastern neighbour thought, and he noticed, rather usefully, that the two did not always agree on what had actually happened. That little observation would shape his entire life. It helps to understand just how vast and strange the world looked from where he was standing. The known world, to a person living in that time and place, stretched from the western edge of the Mediterranean to the mysterious frontiers of India, and almost everything in the middle of that enormous span belonged in one way or another to Persia. We are talking about an empire so large that a royal messenger could ride for months and never leave its borders, an empire that swallowed dozens of nations, hundreds of languages, and more gold than the Greek mind could easily picture. To the scattered, quarrelsome Greek city-states, which could barely agree on the time of day, let alone unite under one banner, Persia was less a country, and more a force of nature, the way a small coastal village might think about the entire ocean. Herodotus grew up in the shadow of that immensity, which gave him a healthy sense that the Greek world, for all its pride, was a relatively small player on a very crowded board. That perspective is rare and valuable, and it kept his curiosity from ever becoming purely patriotic. He wanted to understand the giant, not just curse it. When he was around 5 years old, an event shook the whole Greek world. In 479 BC, a coalition of Greek city-states crushed a massive Persian army at a place called Plataea, ending one of the most famous invasions in history. Now, a 5-year-old does not understand geopolitics, but a 5-year-old absolutely understands when every adult in town is suddenly tense, then suddenly celebrating, then telling and retelling the same war stories at every gathering for the rest of his childhood. That experience planted a seed. While other kids were learning their letters, this one was quietly chewing on a question that would haunt him forever. Why do people do this to each other? Why do entire nations march thousands of miles just to set each other on fire over grudges most of them barely understand? Most people grow out of asking why. Children ask it constantly, usually about why the sky's up there and why they cannot eat dessert first, and then somewhere around adolescence the adults wear them down and they stop. Herodotus, to his eternal credit and our enormous benefit, simply never quit. He kept asking why straight into adulthood, except now he had money, mobility, and the patience to actually go looking for answers. That combination, an unstoppable curiosity attached to a guy with travel funds, is basically how the entire field of history got invented. Here is the thing that made him genuinely revolutionary, and it sounds almost too simple to be impressive. Before him, people who wrote about the past mostly picked one story, the most flattering or the most dramatic one, and ran with it. If a city wanted to believe its founder was personally favoured by the gods, well, that became the official record, and anyone who disagreed could go argue with a wall. Herodotus refused to play that game. When he wanted to know what happened, he did not settle for a single account. He collected as many versions as he could find, from as many different peoples as he could reach, and then he laid them side by side and compared them like a detective comparing witness statements. Sometimes he flat out told his readers that he personally found a story ridiculous, but was including it anyway because someone had sincerely told it to him. That habit, treating rumour and propaganda as evidence to be weighed rather than gospel to be repeated, is exactly why later generations slapped him with the title Father of History. Not a bad nickname, considering the competition mostly got remembered as the father of nothing in particular. Of course, calling someone the father of history is generous when you read some of his weaker moments, and we will get to a few absolute whoppers later in this series involving gold-digging ants and gift-wrapped corpses. The man believed a few things that would not survive a modern fact-check, but that is the charm of him. He was not pretending to be an oracle handing down certainties. He was a guy doing his best with the tools available in a world without printing presses, libraries you could trust, or any way to verify a story except asking a local and hoping they were not pulling your leg. Naturally, a lot of locals were pulling his leg. He still wrote it all down, which is more honest than most. It is worth picturing how he actually did the work, because there was no romantic archive waiting for him, no library where the truth sat neatly filed and labelled. His research method was, by modern standards, gloriously low-tech. He went places. He climbed onto ships, joined caravans, walked dusty roads, and turned up in foreign cities where he did not speak the language and started asking strangers to tell him things. He interviewed priests who guarded temple records, cornered old soldiers who remembered campaigns firsthand, chatted with merchants who had seen distant lands, and listened to local storytellers who were absolutely certain their hometown was the centre of every important event in history. He measured monuments with his own steps, sketched out coastlines, tasted unfamiliar food, and noted down customs that struck him as bizarre, which to a Greek was most of them. Then he hauled all of it home in his head and on his scrolls, and tried to make a coherent picture out of the contradictions. He got plenty wrong, but the sheer ambition of trying to describe the entire known world and explain its biggest war by actually going out and asking the people who lived in it had simply never been attempted at that scale before. He was, in the most literal sense, a travel writer, a war correspondent, an anthropologist, and a gossip columnist, all rolled into one robe, several centuries before any of those jobs had names. Now, when Herodotus finally sat down to crack open his big question about why the Greeks and the Persians ended up at war, he did something delightfully petty and very human. He started by reporting how the Persians themselves explained the whole feud, and the Persian explanation reads less like sober diplomacy and more like two neighbours keeping a wildly detailed scorecard of who wronged whom first. According to the learned men of Persia, the entire centuries-long conflict could be traced back to a series of kidnappings. Not battles, not treaties, kidnappings. Specifically, the kidnapping of various women, which apparently each side kept careful track of like an accountant balancing a ledger of grudges. The way the Persians told it, it all kicked off when some Phoenician traders snatched a Greek princess named Io and carried her off to Egypt. Io was, in this version, the daughter of a king, minding her own business near the shore where the foreign traders had docked their goods. The story goes that while she and some other women were browsing the merchandise, the sailors seized the moment and the women both, hauling several of them aboard and setting sail before anyone could stop them. Strike one by the Greek count. The Greeks, allegedly not the type to let an insult slide, retaliated by sailing over and abducting a princess named Europa from the Phoenician city of Tyre. Europa would go on to lend her name to an entire continent, which is a peculiar honour for someone whose chief claim to fame in these accounts was being carried off in a reprisal raid. So now we are even, 1-1, and any sensible group of adults would have stopped there. They did not stop there. The Greeks went back for seconds and snatched another woman, Medea, from a distant kingdom called Colchis on the far shore of the Black Sea, a place the Greeks regarded as the very edge of the civilized map. Medea, in the legends, was a king's daughter, wrapped up in the famous voyage of the heroes who sailed off chasing a golden fleece. But stripped of the magic and monsters, the Persian version treats her simply as one more woman taken from her homeland by Greek raiders. That put the running total at 2 abductions by the Greeks against 1 by the Easterners, a lead the Greeks apparently felt rather smug about. Then, generations later, a Trojan prince named Paris heard about this whole tit-for-tat tradition and decided he wanted in. He figured that since the Greeks had grabbed 2 of their women and never paid any real price for it, he could simply help himself to a Greek woman and call it justice. So he sailed over and carried off Helen, the famously beautiful queen whose abduction, in the legends, launched the entire Trojan War. From the Persian point of view, this is where the Greeks completely lost the plot. Up until then, everyone had treated these kidnappings as regrettable but ultimately survivable inconveniences. Nobody had raised an army over them. The unwritten rule, apparently, was that stealing a woman was rude but not worth a war, partly because, as the Persians dryly noted, no woman gets carried off who did not on some level allow it. That is the kind of breathtakingly convenient logic ancient empires used to excuse themselves, and Herodotus reports it without necessarily endorsing it, which is very much his style. But the Greeks, the Persians, grumbled, threw all proportion out the window. Instead of shrugging off the loss of Helen the way everyone else had shrugged off the earlier abductions, they assembled a gigantic fleet, sailed across the sea, and besieged the city of Troy for 10 long years, eventually flattening the place over a single woman. To the Persians, this was the original sin, the moment the Greeks revealed themselves as a people who would cross an entire sea to wage war over a grievance that everyone else considered a minor accounting dispute. From that day on, the Persians claimed they regarded the Greek world as fundamentally hostile, and the centuries of warfare that followed were simply the long aftershock of that overreaction. A whole civilization-spanning war explained as the result of one side refusing to let a breakup go. Honestly, relatable. Here is where Herodotus does the thing that separates him from a mere collector of gossip. He lays out this elaborate Persian revenge ledger, the whole 2-to-1 scoreboard and the Trojan grand finale, and then he essentially raises an eyebrow at it. He notes that the Phoenicians, the very people accused of starting the chain with Io, told the story completely differently. In their telling, nobody kidnapped Io at all. They claimed she left with the traders willingly after a romance went sideways, and only later spun it into an abduction tale to save face once she found herself far from home and not entirely thrilled about it. 2 peoples, 2 flatly contradictory accounts of the same event, each carefully arranged to make the teller look blameless. Herodotus presents both, and then does something almost startlingly modern. He more or less throws up his hands at the mythology entirely. He decides he is not going to get tangled up in arguments about who stole which legendary princess, because once you are debating the romantic decisions of women who may or may not have existed, you have left the realm of anything you can actually verify. Instead, he announces that he will set aside the storybook grudges and the divine soap opera, and he will point his investigation at someone he can actually pin down. He wants the first real, concrete, historically documented person who, to his own knowledge, deliberately wronged the Greeks. Not a myth, not a princess in a poem, an actual ruler with an actual reign whose actions actually started measurable trouble. It is the moment where legend hands the microphone over to history, and you can almost feel him rolling up his sleeves. And the man he settles on, the first true culprit in his reckoning, is a king of a kingdom called Lydia. Lydia sat in the western part of what is now Turkey, conveniently positioned right where the Greek coastal cities met the larger landmass of the east, which made it a natural crossroads for trade and less happily for conflict. Its capital was a city called Sardis, a wealthy hub perched beneath a steep fortified hill, and running near it was a river called the Pactolus that, according to the stories, carried flecks of gold down from the mountains in its sand. Whether or not you believe a river can hand out free gold, the kingdom was undeniably rich, sitting on trade routes and mineral wealth that turned its rulers into some of the most lavishly funded monarchs of the age. His name was Croesus, and he will become one of the great tragic figures of this entire saga, a man so impossibly rich that his name became a byword for wealth, in languages that would not exist for another 1,000 years. We will spend serious time with Croesus soon, because his rise and his spectacular slow-motion downfall are where Herodotus first plants the idea that runs underneath everything else he ever wrote. That idea is this: fate has a plan for everyone. The gods drop hints about it through oracles and dreams and strange omens, and the punchline of human existence is that those hints are always technically accurate, and almost never understood in time to do anybody any good. The oracle never lies. People just hear what they want to hear, march off confidently in the wrong direction, and only grasp the true meaning when it is far, far too late to change course. Keep that pattern in the back of your mind, because once you start noticing it, you will see it absolutely everywhere in this story, like a curse with excellent comedic timing. But before we can properly understand the catastrophe waiting for Croesus, we have to go further back, because his royal family did not simply inherit a clean and honourable crown. The throne of Lydia came with baggage. Specifically, it came with a curse, and that curse was earned the old-fashioned way, through a betrayal so strange and so personal that it reads more like a stage play than a chapter of political history. To understand why a glittering empire eventually came crashing down, we have to rewind more than 100 years before Croesus and step into, of all places, a royal bedroom. The king ruling Lydia back then was named Candoles, and he was the last of a long dynasty called the Heraclids, a line that traced its bragging rights all the way back to the legendary strongman Heracles. Candoles had a comfortable kingdom, a respectable lineage, and one particular obsession that would end up dismantling everything his ancestors had built. He was utterly, embarrassingly besotted with his own wife. Now, being deeply in love with your spouse is, in most centuries, considered a charming quality. The problem with Candoles was that his admiration curdled into something less like devotion, and more like the behaviour of a man showing off a sports car. He was convinced his wife was the most beautiful woman alive, and crucially, he could not stand the idea that other people did not fully appreciate just how lucky he was. This is where the story slides from a sweet marriage into a slow-motion disaster, and it is worth pausing to appreciate the cultural stakes, because to a modern listener, the whole thing might sound like a minor lapse in taste. In the world Candoles lived in, particularly outside of Greece, modesty was not a suggestion. It was close to sacred. Among these peoples, even a man being seen without his clothes was considered a serious humiliation, and the standards around women were stricter by an order of magnitude. A respectable wife was simply not seen by other men in any state of undress, ever, full stop. So when Candoles started scheming about how to prove his wife was as gorgeous as he claimed, he was not planning a harmless brag. He was lining up a violation of one of the deepest taboos his society had. His chosen audience for this terrible idea was a trusted bodyguard named Guys, one of his favourite officers, the kind of loyal subordinate a king confides in. Candoles began working on the poor man relentlessly, insisting that words could never capture the queen's beauty, and that Gyges simply had to see her for himself to believe it. Gyges, to his enormous credit, was horrified and tried to talk his boss out of it. He pointed out, quite sensibly, that a man tends to lose his sense of proportion about these things, that he took the king at his word already, and that some lines really should not be crossed. He more or less begged not to be dragged into it. There is something almost funny about watching the bodyguard be the only adult in the room, repeatedly trying to apply the brakes while his king cheerfully steers them both off a cliff. But Candoles would not let it go, because powerful men who are used to getting their way tend to treat a polite refusal as an opening bid rather than a final answer. He devised a specific plan. He would hide Gyges inside the royal bedchamber, behind the open door, so that when the queen entered to undress for the night she would not notice him. Gyges could observe, confirm the king's boasting, and then slip out unseen while her back was turned. Candoles presented this scheme as foolproof, the kind of confident reassurance that, in stories like this, is practically a guarantee that everything is about to go catastrophically wrong. Gyges, cornered and unable to defy a direct royal order without risking his own neck, reluctantly agreed, naturally. So that evening it played out exactly as planned, right up until the part where it did not. Gyges was tucked behind the door, the queen entered, and the king's foolish demonstration was carried out. The problem is that the queen was not a prop. She was a person, and a perceptive one, and as Gyges crept toward the exit she caught sight of him slipping away. In that instant she understood precisely what had happened, and exactly who had arranged it. And here is the detail that makes her one of the most quietly formidable figures in the whole account. She did not scream, she did not make a scene, she did not let on that she had noticed anything at all. She simply went to bed, said nothing, and spent the night turning the situation over in her mind with the cold precision of someone drawing up a plan. The king had no idea that his clever little stunt had just detonated his entire future. By her culture's reckoning, a profound dishonour had been done to her, and someone was going to answer for it. The next morning she summoned Gyges, having quietly made sure her most trusted servants were ready, and within reach so that he could not simply bolt. When he arrived, expecting perhaps some ordinary errand, she laid out his situation with chilling clarity. She told him she now knew everything, and that because of what he had seen, only one of two roads remained open to him, and he was going to walk one of them before he left the room. Down the first road he could kill the king who had engineered this disgrace, take the throne, and take her as his wife, becoming ruler of all Lydia. Down the second road he would die that very moment, so that he could never again make a habit of seeing things he had no right to see, and obeying orders he had no business obeying. There was no third option. There was no apologizing his way out. He had been an instrument of her humiliation, and now he would be the instrument of her revenge, whether against the king or against himself. Put yourself in his sandals for a moment, because it is a genuinely impossible spot. He had not wanted any part of this. He had argued against it. He had been ordered into a crime by the one person he was sworn to obey, and now the victim of that crime was handing him a choice between committing regicide or being executed for a humiliation he had not even wanted to witness. There was no clean exit. Loyalty had been turned into a trap with the door already locked. Gyges did what most people in a corner would do when the only alternative is immediate death. He chose to live. He agreed to the Queen's terms, though he reportedly asked somewhat plaintively how exactly he was supposed to overcome a king. The Queen, who had clearly thought this through far better than her husband had thought through anything, told him the deed would be done in the very same bedroom that had started the whole mess, from behind the very same door, using the king's own scheme against him. There is a grim poetry to that arrangement that even Gyges could probably appreciate, right up until he had to carry it out. And so it happened. That night the positions were reversed. The man who had once hidden behind the door as an unwilling spectator now waited there as something else entirely, and when the moment came, the reign of Candoles and the long Heraclid dynasty ended with it. With a single night's work, a bodyguard who had begged to be left out of his master's vanity project found himself married to a queen and seated on the throne of one of the richest kingdoms in the known world. He founded an entirely new royal line called the Myrmnads, the dynasty that would, several generations down the road, produce the very Croesus we met a moment ago. So the spectacular wealth and tragic destiny of Croesus rest, at the very foundation, on a crown that was seized in the dark over a husband's inability to keep a private blessing private. Not exactly a noble origin story for a great house, but history rarely hands out clean ones. Now, you might think a man who came to power that way would simply enjoy his unbelievable luck and never look back. The trouble is that seizing a throne by killing its previous occupant tends to leave a few people unconvinced about the legitimacy of the new management. The Lydian people were, understandably, less than thrilled to wake up and discover that their king had been replaced overnight by his own guard, and grumbling threatened to spill into open revolt. To avoid the whole thing collapsing into civil war, both sides agreed to take the matter to the highest authority anyone in that world recognized, the oracle at Delphi, the famous Greek shrine where, it was believed, the god Apollo answered questions through a priestess. It is hard to overstate how seriously people took this place. Delphi sat high on the slopes of a mountain, and kings, generals, and ordinary anxious people travelled enormous distances and paid handsomely for the privilege of asking the god a single question about their future. A priestess, seated over a cleft in the rock from which strange vapours were said to rise, would enter a kind of trance and deliver answers that the temple staff then arranged into verse. The genius of the place, and the reason it stayed in business for centuries, was that its answers were almost always cleverly ambiguous, capable of being read two completely different ways. Whatever happened, the oracle could claim it had been right all along, which is a remarkably durable business model when you think about it. People did not trust Delphi in spite of this slipperiness. They trusted it because the slipperiness was mistaken for divine subtlety, and the deal was simple. If the oracle confirmed Gyges as the rightful king, the people would accept him. If not, he would have to give the throne back. The oracle returned its verdict, and on the surface it was excellent news for Gyges. It affirmed that he should rule, securing his crown and quieting the rebellion. But the god, in the tradition of every oracle in this entire story, did not hand out a blessing without slipping a knife into the fine print. Along with the confirmation came a warning, delivered in the kind of language that sounds vaguely ominous in the moment, and turns out to be devastatingly specific in hindsight. The oracle declared that a reckoning would come for what had been done, that the blood spilled to win the throne would be repaid, and that the price would fall not on Gyges himself, nor on his son, nor his grandson, but on the 4th generation of his descendants. In other words, you can keep the kingdom you stole, but the universe has opened a tab, and one of your great-great-grandchildren is going to pick up the bill. This is the moment the curse settles over the entire Myrmnad line like a fog that nobody can quite see, but everybody is breathing. And here is the genuinely chilling part of how Herodotus uses it. Nobody at the time treats it as an urgent threat, because why would they? The punishment is 4 generations away. That is the ancient equivalent of being told a problem will affect your descendants in the year 2150. You nod, you file it under not my problem, and you go about your reign. Gyges himself ruled long and successfully, expanded the kingdom, and even sent generous gifts to that very oracle at Delphi, as if a few nice offerings might quietly close out a debt that the gods had already decided was non-negotiable. Spoiler, it does not work that way. The oracle, as always, was simply telling the plain truth in advance, and as always the people it concerned heard the part they liked and shrugged off the part they did not. Herodotus then walks us down the family tree, watching the doomed clock tick generation by generation, and the procession of names is worth following because each one is another step toward the bill coming due. After Gyges came his son Ades, who inherited the kingdom and the curse together, though he would have only been dimly aware of carrying the second one. After Ades came his son Sadeas, the third link in the chain, the kingdom growing in wealth and power all the while, blissfully unbothered by the deadline ticking quietly in the background. And after Sadeas came Aliats, a long-reigning and formidable king who pushed Lydian power to new heights, and is sometimes credited with overseeing the world's first real use of standardized coined money, a genuinely civilization-altering innovation. Before coins, trade meant lugging around lumps of metal and weighing them out, haggling over purity each time, which was about as convenient as it sounds. A stamped guaranteed coin changed everything, and the fact that this quiet revolution in how humans buy and sell things may have begun in Lydia is one of those footnotes that turns out to be far more important than most of the wars surrounding it. Aliates was also a serious military operator. He waged a long, grinding war against a powerful neighbouring people called the Medes, a conflict that dragged on for years until it produced one of the most famous moments in ancient warfare. In the middle of a battle between the two armies, the day suddenly turned to night as a solar eclipse swept overhead. Neither side had the faintest idea what was happening, only that the sun had vanished while they were busy trying to kill each other, and both armies were so unnerved that they put down their weapons on the spot and hastily agreed to make peace. An eclipse, in other words, did what years of bloodshed could not. The peace was sealed by a royal marriage, the standard ancient method of turning enemies into reluctant in-laws. There is one more thread worth pulling here, because it explains why Herodotus fingered this particular dynasty as the first real offenders against the Greeks, rather than picking some other ruler entirely. As the Myrmnad kings grew stronger, generation by generation, they kept pressing westward against the wealthy Greek cities scattered along the coast of Asia Minor, the very edge where the Greek world brushed up against the Lydian one. These coastal cities were prosperous, independent-minded, and exactly the sort of tempting prize an expanding kingdom finds impossible to ignore. So the Lydian kings began chipping away at them, sometimes through outright attack, sometimes through the slower pressure of intimidation and tribute, gradually folding Greek communities into their sphere of influence. In Herodotus's telling, this is the concrete, documented beginning of the long antagonism, an actual king with actual armies subjecting actual Greeks, as opposed to a princess in a poem being carried off by sailors nobody could name. It is the difference between legend and ledger, and it is precisely the kind of verifiable wrong he had set out to find. By the time the crown reached Croesus, the kingdom he inherited was not just rich and powerful. It was a kingdom that had spent generations leaning on the Greek world, which makes the irony of his eventual fate all the sweeter, because the man who pressured the Greeks would one day stake everything on the word of a Greek oracle and lose it all to a misread sentence. From the outside, the Myrmnad dynasty looked like an unbroken success story. 4 generations of increasingly mighty rulers turning a stolen throne into a regional superpower. But that 4th generation is precisely where the oracle had set the trap. Aliates was the 3rd king after the founder, which made his heir the 4th generation of Gyges' line, the exact descendant the god had named all those years before, and the son who would inherit Aliates' throne The man standing at the spot where a century-old debt was finally going to be collected was none other than Croesus. The richest king in the world, the man Herodotus had singled out as the first true wrongdoer against the Greeks, was also, by an arithmetic nobody had bothered to take seriously, the appointed heir to a curse earned in a bedroom 4 generations earlier. He inherited the gold, the power, the glittering capital city, and a debt to the gods that he did not even know was attached to his name. And this is the thread that ties everything together and sets the tone for everything still to come. The throne of Lydia was bought with blood, won through a betrayal that turned a loyal man into a killer and a wronged woman into a kingmaker. In the moral universe Herodotus is sketching, a debt like that does not simply fade with time, and wealth, however staggering, cannot buy it off. The Mermnads spent 4 generations getting richer and more comfortable, never quite believing that the warning applied to them, right up until the moment it became impossible to ignore. A crown taken in the dark always eventually demands its payment in the light. And the man unlucky enough to be standing there when the reckoning finally arrived had no idea, as he counted his unmatched fortune, that the most dangerous inheritance his ancestors left him was not a single gold coin. It was a promise the gods had made 100 years before he was born, and the gods, unlike kings, do not forget their accounts. When Croesus finally settled onto the throne, he wasted no time turning Lydia into the envy of the known world. He expanded its borders, gathered tribute from the Greek coastal cities his ancestors had been leaning on, and stuffed the treasury at Sardis until the kingdom shimmered with more gold than any single human being had ever reasonably needed. His name became so synonymous with riches that, more than 2,000 years later, people who have never heard of Lydia still say someone is as rich as Croesus, without the faintest idea they are quoting an ancient cautionary tale. He had everything a man of that era could possibly want, which predictably meant he immediately started craving the one thing money could not buy. He did not just want to be the richest man on earth, he wanted official confirmation that he was also the happiest. Wealthy people wanting a trophy for their feelings is, it turns out, not a modern invention. His chance to collect that trophy seemed to arrive when a famous visitor turned up at his court, a man from Athens named Solon. Now, Solon was no ordinary tourist. Back home in Athens, he was a celebrated lawgiver, a poet, and one of the handful of thinkers later generations grouped together as the wise men of the age, the kind of person whose opinions carried real weight across the Greek world. He had recently overhauled the laws of his city, and then, in a move that any modern reformer would recognize, he left town for a decade so that nobody could pester him into changing them back. Officially, he was travelling to broaden his mind. Unofficially, he was avoiding a flood of complaints. Either way, his wandering eventually brought him to Sardis, where Croesus received him with the lavish hospitality of a man who very much wanted to impress. Croesus did what any insecure billionaire would do. He had his servants give Solon the full tour of the royal treasuries, parading him past room after room of heaped gold, precious stones, and accumulated splendour, the ancient equivalent of casually leaving your bank statement on the kitchen counter when company comes over. He let the Athenians soak in the full scale of his fortune for several days, and then, once he was confident the man had seen enough to be properly awed, he asked the question he had been building toward the entire time. He asked Solon, who, in all his extensive travels and wide experience of the world, was the happiest person he had ever encountered. Croesus asked this fully expecting the obvious answer, which was, of course, the immensely rich king currently standing right in front of him with the bedazzling tour fresh in mind. It was less a question than a setup for a compliment. Solon, unfortunately for the royal ego, was not in the flattery business. He thought about it and named a perfectly ordinary Athenian called Tellus. Croesus must have blinked. Not a king, not a conqueror, not even anyone famous, just some regular citizen nobody outside Athens had ever heard of. When Croesus, somewhat stunned, asked why on earth this nobody deserved the title, Solon laid out his reasoning, and it is worth following because it is the philosophical heart of this entire story. Tellus, he explained, had lived in a city that was doing well. He had raised fine children who all survived to adulthood and gave him grandchildren. He had enough to live on comfortably without being extravagant, and then, at the end, he died gloriously in battle defending his homeland, after which his grateful city buried him with the highest honours right where he fell. A good life, a good family, and a good and honourable death, all wrapped up neatly. That, Solon suggested, was a man whose happiness you could actually measure, because his story was complete. Croesus was not thrilled, but he figured surely he would at least take the silver medal. So he asked who came in second, fully expecting his own name to finally make an appearance. Instead, Solon told him about two young brothers named Cleobis and Beaton, and the story did Croesus no favours at all. These two were strong, well-regarded young men from Argos, devoted to their mother, who was a priestess. The tale goes that one festival day she needed to be carried to the temple, but the oxen meant to pull her cart had not arrived from the fields in time, so her two sons simply yoked themselves to the cart and hauled their mother a considerable distance to the temple themselves, an act of devotion that earned them tremendous admiration from everyone who saw it. Their mother, overflowing with pride, prayed to the goddess to grant her boys the very best thing a human being could possibly receive. The brothers, exhausted from their effort, lay down to rest inside the temple, fell asleep, and never woke up. According to Solon, the goddess had answered the prayer perfectly. She had given them the finest gift available to mortals by letting them die quietly at the absolute peak of their honour and strength, before life could turn around and take any of it back. You can imagine how a man sitting on the largest pile of gold in the world received the news that the two happiest people Solon could think of were a dead soldier and a pair of brothers who passed away in their sleep at the gym, essentially. Croesus, by now thoroughly irritated, demanded to know why his own staggering fortune counted for so little that he had not even cracked the list. And here Solon delivered the line that gives this chapter its weight, the one idea Croesus would spend the rest of his life failing to understand until it was carved into him the hard way. Solon explained that human life is long, and a long life shows a person a tremendous number of days, and no two of those days ever bring exactly the same fortune. The gods, he warned, have a habit of dangling a glimpse of happiness in front of people only to overturn it completely later on. Because of this, you simply cannot call any living person happy, no matter how rich or powerful, because their story is not over yet. Anything can still happen. A man drowning in gold today might lose it all tomorrow, while a man of modest means might end his days in peace. The only point at which you can safely judge whether a life was happy is after it has ended and can no longer change. Until a person is dead, Solon concluded, the most you can call them is lucky, and luck is a notoriously fickle houseguest. Count no man happy until you have seen the end of him. Croesus thought this was the most foolish thing he had ever heard. Here was a man dismissing all his visible, present, undeniable good fortune in favour of some vague philosophy about waiting until the very end to tally the score. He sent Solon away considering him a thoroughly unimpressive fool, which is exactly the sort of confident dismissal that, in a story like this, functions as a flashing warning sign. The audience knows what is coming. Croesus naturally does not. He returns to enjoying his riches, fully convinced that the wise Athenians simply did not appreciate the obvious supremacy of a full treasury. The lesson, as these things go, did not stay theoretical for long. Not long after Solon left, a terrible misfortune fell on Croesus, and the way Herodotus tells it, the gods themselves had grown annoyed at the king for daring to think himself the happiest of men. It began, as these warnings so often do, with a dream. Croesus had two sons. One was deaf and unable to speak, written off by his father as essentially useless, which tells you something about the era's bedside manner. The other son, named Atys, was everything a king could want in an heir, capable, admired, the clear future of the dynasty. And it was Atys who appeared in his father's nightmare. Croesus dreamed, with awful clarity, that his beloved son was going to die, struck down by a point of iron, just that. A sharp iron point would be the end of the young man on whom the entire future rested. Croesus woke up shaken to his core, and he immediately set about doing everything in his power to outwit the dream, which is the part of the story that always lands hardest, because every single precaution he takes turns out to be a step toward the very disaster he is trying to prevent. First, he hurried to find Atys a wife and got him married, on the theory that a settled family man stays closer to home and out of danger. Then he pulled the young man away from anything to do with military command, refusing to let him lead troops on campaign, as a prince of his standing normally would. Most pointedly of all, he had every spear, javelin, and similar weapon taken down from the walls of the men's quarters, where they were customarily displayed, and moved out of sight into storerooms, terrified that one might somehow fall and strike his son. He essentially weapon-proofed the palace, the ancient version of a parent baby-proofing every sharp corner in the house, except with the added pressure of believing a prophecy was actively trying to kill his kid. It is touching and futile in equal measure. For a while, life carried on. But then trouble arrived in the form of a monster, or at least a very large and very angry animal. In a region called Mysia, an enormous wild boar had come down from a mountain and was rampaging through the farmland, destroying crops and resisting every attempt the locals made to bring it down. Desperate, the Mysians sent a delegation to Croesus, begging him to send his son along with a hunting party to help kill the beast that was ruining them. Croesus, remembering the dream, agreed to send a party of his finest men and his best hunting dogs, but he flatly refused to send Attis. A boar hunt is, after all, exactly the kind of activity where sharp iron points fly around with enthusiasm. He thought he was being clever and protective. He was about to discover that you cannot simply opt your child out of fate by submitting a polite decline. Because Attis overheard the arrangement, and he was not pleased. He came to his father and made a genuinely persuasive case, the kind that any spirited young person who feels overly sheltered would recognize. He pointed out that he had always been expected to win glory in war and in the hunt, that those pursuits were the proper measure of a prince, and that lately his father had been keeping him locked away from both for no reason he could understand. He wanted to know what the people would think of a future king who slunk around avoiding every danger, and how he was supposed to face his new wife as anything other than a coward hiding behind palace walls. It was a reasonable complaint from a young man who had no idea his father was guarding him against a nightmare. Cornered, Croesus finally broke down and explained the dream, the iron point, all of it, confessing that he was simply trying to keep his son alive long enough to outlast the danger. Attis listened, and then he made the argument that sealed everything, because it sounded so logical. He told his father that he understood the fear now, but pointed out that the dream had specifically warned of death by an iron point. A boar, he reasoned, has no hands and wields no iron weapons. It has tusks. If the prophecy was about iron, then a hunt against a tusked animal posed no threat at all, and his father could let him go with a clear conscience. It is a beautifully constructed piece of reasoning, the kind that feels airtight in the moment, and it is exactly the trap these stories specialize in. The prophecy never said the boar would do the killing. Croesus, perhaps worn down, perhaps relieved by the apparent loophole, gave in and agreed to let his son join the hunt, but he insisted on one safeguard. There was staying at his court at that time a man named Adrastus, and his backstory matters. Adrastus was a foreigner of royal blood who had come to Croesus as a suppliant after a catastrophe of his own. He had, by pure accident, killed his own brother, and as a result had been driven from his homeland, stripped of everything. Croesus had taken him in, and following the customs of the time, performed the rituals to cleanse him of the blood guilt, and welcomed him as a guest in his household. So when the king needed someone to watch over his precious son on the hunt, he turned to Adrastus, reminding the grateful man of all the kindness he'd been shown, and asking him to serve as Attis's personal guardian and protector, to keep him safe from any harm and especially from any robbers who might cross their path. Croesus, you will notice, was worried about robbers, about human attackers with weapons. He had completely fixed his fear on the wrong source of iron. Adrastus, deeply indebted to his host, promised to bring the young man home safe and sound. Naturally, this is precisely the promise that was never going to be kept. The hunting party set off, found the boar, and surrounded it on the mountainside, hurling their spears at the cornered animal. And here the dream collected its due in the cruelest way imaginable. Adrastus, the very man entrusted with keeping the prince alive, threw his spear at the boar, missed the beast entirely, and struck Attis instead. The iron point of the spear found the king's son exactly as the nightmare had foretold, and the loophole about the boar's tusks turned out to mean nothing at all, because the prophecy had never specified whose hand would hold the iron. The man assigned to protect Attis from harm became, through nothing but a single errant throw, the instrument of his death. There is no villain in this. There is only the terrible machinery of a fate that bends every good intention toward the same fixed outcome. The hunters carried the dreadful news back to Sardis, and Croesus was shattered. He had done everything, every precaution a frantic father could devise, and the dream had simply waited and found a path around all of it. What makes the king's reaction so striking is what he did not do. When Adrastus came before him, utterly destroyed by what had happened and begging to be put to death over the body of the young man he had killed, Croesus did not blame him. He looked at the broken man and recognized that Adrastus was not truly the cause. The real architect of this grief, he understood, was the same divine power that had sent the warning dream in the first place. Adrastus had merely been the unlucky tool through which a fixed destiny worked itself out. So the king, even in the depths of his loss, forgave the man and held the gods responsible instead. But Adrastus could not forgive himself. This was a man who had already fled one homeland for accidentally killing his own brother, and now he had accidentally killed the son of the one person on earth who had shown him mercy. He felt himself to be the most cursed and unfortunate person alive, hunted by misfortune wherever he went. Overwhelmed by a grief and guilt too heavy to carry, he ended his own life at the tomb of the young man, unable to live with what fate had made of him. It is a profoundly sad conclusion to a story that is, at its core, about how love and care offer no protection against destiny. Croesus, the richest man in the world, had used every resource he possessed to shield the thing he loved most, and it had not mattered in the slightest. Wealth, it turns out, is no defence against the iron point waiting in your future. The king sank into mourning for 2 full years, his fortune suddenly looking very hollow indeed. What eventually pulled Croesus out of his grief was, fittingly, the rise of a threat large enough to demand his full attention. Word reached Sardis that the political map of the East had been violently redrawn. A new power was surging up right on Lydia's doorstep. A man named Cyrus, leading the Persians, had overthrown the king of the neighbouring Medes, a king who happened to be his own grandfather, and in doing so had absorbed that whole kingdom and begun assembling an empire of genuinely alarming size. We will spend real time with Cyrus and his remarkable origin shortly, because his story deserves its own telling, but for now what mattered to Croesus was simpler. The comfortable, familiar neighbour he had once been on peaceful terms with was gone, replaced almost overnight by a rising conqueror whose ambitions seemed to have no obvious ceiling, and whose growing territory now pressed right up against his own. Croesus weighed his options and decided the wisest move was to strike first, before this Persian newcomer grew any stronger and came knocking on Lydia's gates uninvited. There was personal feeling mixed in as well, since the deposed Median king had been connected to Croesus through marriage ties between their royal houses, giving him a convenient sense of grievance to layer on top of his strategic worry. But Croesus, having learned absolutely nothing from the way prophecy had toyed with him over his son, decided he would not march off to war without first consulting the gods about whether it was a good idea. This time, though, he wanted to be smart about it. He had heard there were many oracles scattered across the world, and he was not about to bet his kingdom on the wrong one. So he devised a test, and it is honestly one of the more entertaining schemes in the whole account. He sent messengers to all the most famous oracles, including the great shrine at Delphi, with strict instructions. On an exact, agreed-upon day, no matter where each messenger happened to be, they were to ask the oracle the very same question. What was King Croesus doing at that precise moment back home in Sardis? He then made sure he was doing something so bizarre and unpredictable that no ordinary person could ever guess it. On the appointed day, he personally chopped up a tortoise and a lamb and boiled them together in a bronze cauldron with a bronze lid, a combination so random it could only be verified by genuine divine knowledge. Most of the oracles failed the audition completely, but the priestess at Delphi nailed it, reportedly describing the smell of tough-shelled tortoise and lamb stewing together in bronze before the messenger had even finished speaking. Delphi had passed the exam with flying colours, and Croesus was convinced he had found an oracle worth trusting with his future. Having verified Delphi to his satisfaction, Croesus showered the shrine with offerings on a scale that bordered on the absurd, melting down enormous quantities of gold into ingots and crafting golden statues and bowls and other treasures, the ancient equivalent of trying to buy a deity's loyalty with a truly obscene tip. These gifts were so spectacular that, by the time our investigator came wandering through generations later, a number of them were apparently still on display at the shrine, and he tells us he saw some of them with his own eyes, including a great mixing bowl and other dazzling pieces, though by then a few items had been moved around and relabeled in ways that clearly irritated his sense of accuracy. It is a small but telling moment, because it reminds us that for all the legendary dreamlike quality of these stories, the man recording them was standing in real temples, looking at real objects, and trying to match the tall tales against whatever physical evidence he could put his hands on. The gold was not a metaphor, you could go and look at it. Then, confident he had purchased the goodwill of the gods, he sent his messengers back to Delphi with the question that actually mattered. Should he march against the Persians, and should he look for allies to join him? The oracle gave him an answer that he received as wonderful news, and that we, with the benefit of hindsight, can recognize as a beautifully laid trap. It told him that if he made war on the Persians, he would destroy a great empire. Croesus heard exactly what he wanted to hear. He pictured the mighty Persian realm crumbling before him and never once paused to ask the obvious follow-up question, which was, of course, which great empire? The oracle, true to its nature, had told the literal truth in a form perfectly designed to be misunderstood by a man too eager to doubt it. There was indeed a great empire about to be destroyed in this war. It simply was not the one Croesus assumed. The oracle added one more cryptic note, advising him that he need only worry about his throne when a mule became king of the Persians, which Croesus laughed off as an impossibility, since the day a mule sits on a royal throne is presumably the day everything else has gone equally sideways. Reassured by a prophecy he had thoroughly misread, and a warning he had dismissed as nonsense, Croesus assembled his allies, gathered his formidable army, and marched east, crossing the river that marked the boundary of his secure territory and pushing into the contested lands beyond, fully expecting to dismantle the upstart Persian state. He was so certain of victory that he had essentially already won the war in his own head, which is, as ever, the most dangerous place for a war to be won. The first clash between the two armies was hard fought, and ended without a clear winner, a bloody stalemate that left neither side able to claim the field. Croesus, looking at the situation and noting that his force was somewhat smaller than he had hoped, made what seemed like a sensible decision. The campaigning season was winding down, so he pulled his army back towards Sardis, intending to wait out the winter, send for fresh reinforcements from his allies, and resume the war properly in the spring. He even dismissed much of the gathered force, sending men home with instructions to regroup later. It was a perfectly conventional plan, the kind any reasonable commander of the era would make. It also relied entirely on his opponent agreeing to follow the same polite seasonal schedule, which his opponent had absolutely no intention of doing. Cyrus, it turned out, did not believe in waiting until spring to do something he could do right now. The moment he realized Croesus was disbanding his army and settling in for a comfortable winter, he pushed his own forces forward at speed, marching straight for Sardis before the Lydians could possibly gather their scattered troops back together. He arrived as his own messenger, as the saying went, catching Croesus badly off guard with a much reduced army and no time to summon help. Croesus scrambled together what cavalry he had, and the Lydian horsemen were genuinely feared, regarded as some of the finest mounted warriors anywhere, skilled with the lance and devastating in open country. Cyrus knew this, and rather than meet that strength head-on, he came up with a trick that was equal parts clever and faintly ridiculous. He had noticed something useful about horses. They cannot stand the smell and the sight of camels, and they will panic and bolt rather than face them. So Cyrus gathered up the camels that had been carrying his supplies and provisions, mounted soldiers on them, and sent this improvised camel cavalry to the front of his line, directly opposite the proud Lydian horsemen. When the two forces met on the plain before Sardis, the Lydian horses caught the scent of the camels and promptly refused to cooperate, wheeling around and fleeing in disorder. To the credit of the Lydian riders, they did not run away. They leapt down from their terrified mounts and fought Cyrus on foot, turning what could have been a rout into a genuine battle. But the advantage had been neatly stolen from them, and in the end Cyrus carried the day. One of history's most feared cavalry forces had been undone by pack animals, which is the sort of detail you could not invent if you tried. The defeated Lydians fell back behind the walls of Sardis, and here Croesus still had reason to hope, because Sardis was reckoned to be very nearly impregnable. It sat against a steep cliff so sheer that one entire side of the fortress was considered impossible to assault, and was therefore barely guarded. Cyrus, frustrated by the strong walls, offered a reward to any soldier who could find a way in, and the way in, as it so often does, came through the one spot everyone assumed was safe. A Persian soldier watched as a Lydian guard up on that supposedly unclimbable cliff dropped his helmet down the slope and then casually scrambled down the rocks to retrieve it before climbing back up. The Persian made a careful mental note of the route. Soon enough, a band of attackers followed that same path up the undefended cliff face, and Sardis fell. The lesson, as always, is that the part of your defences you're most confident about is precisely the part nobody is watching. In the chaos of the city falling, a moment occurred that ties the whole story back to the prophecies hanging over the family. As Persian soldiers swarmed through Sardis, one of them moved to kill Croesus, not recognizing the king in the confusion. And here Croesus's other son, the one who had been written off his whole life because he could not speak, did something he had never done before. Seeing his father about to be struck down, the young man was so overcome that his voice broke free for the first time in his life, and he cried out, begging the soldier not to kill Croesus and naming him as the king. The soldier stopped. The son who had been dismissed as useless had just saved his father's life with the only words he would ever be recorded as speaking, fulfilling yet another old prediction that he would first find his voice on a day of great misfortune. The prophecies in this story have a grim sense of timing, always paying out at the exact moment they will hurt the most. Croesus was taken alive, and Cyrus, in the custom of a conqueror making a decisive statement, had the captured king placed atop a great pyre along with 14 Lydian youths, intending to make an offering of his defeated rival. As Croesus stood there facing the end of everything, with his kingdom gone and his life about to follow, his mind drifted back across the years to that irritating Athenian visitor he had dismissed as a fool. He suddenly understood, with terrible clarity, exactly what Solon had been trying to tell him. He had been the richest and seemingly most fortunate man on earth, and now here he was, stripped of all of it, about to die as a prisoner. No one can be called happy while they still live, because fortune can overturn anything right up until the final moment. Standing on the pyre, Croesus groaned and called out the name of Solon 3 times. Cyrus, watching through his interpreters, was puzzled and asked who this Solon was that the condemned king kept invoking. At first Croesus would not answer, but pressed he finally told the whole story, explaining how a wise Athenian had once warned him that no living person should be called happy, and how he had foolishly ignored it, and how completely the warning had now come true. As Cyrus listened to the tale, something shifted in him. He was, after all, a man at the dizzying height of his own success, and here was living proof of how quickly the heights could collapse. It occurred to him that he was burning alive a fellow human being who had until very recently been every bit as powerful and fortunate as Cyrus was now, and that fortune might just as easily turn on him someday. Moved by the lesson, and by his own sudden unease, Cyrus ordered the fire put out and the king brought down at once. But by then the pyre was already burning, and the flames had spread too far for anyone to extinguish them in time. According to the story, with the fire roaring up around him and no human help left, Croesus called out to the god Apollo, the god of that oracle he had so generously showered with gold, begging for rescue if any of his offerings had ever pleased the divine, and out of a clear sky, the legend says, clouds gathered and a sudden heavy rain came pouring down, dousing the flames and saving the king's life at the last possible instant. Whether you take the rain as divine intervention, or as a remarkably convenient weather event, the result was the same. Croesus stepped down from the pyre alive. From that moment, the relationship between the two men transformed entirely. Cyrus, impressed by the king's wisdom, the hard way, and reluctant to destroy a man the gods themselves seemed to protect, kept Croesus close as an advisor, a defeated monarch who would now whisper counsel into the ear of his conqueror. And it was in this new role that Croesus finally pieced together how thoroughly the oracle had outwitted him. The great empire he had been promised he would destroy had been his own, fed into the war by his own confidence, and the mule who would one day threaten the Persian throne, the warning he had laughed off as impossible, turned out to be Cyrus himself, a man born of mixed and mismatched royal and common parentage, a mule in the metaphorical sense the oracle had intended all along. Every word the oracle spoke had been true. Croesus had simply heard the version he wanted. He sent angry messengers to Delphi to complain that the god had deceived him, and the reply came back, in effect, that the prophecies had been perfectly accurate and that he had no one to blame but himself for failing to ask what they actually meant. Which is, when you think about it, the most honest fine print any fortune-teller has ever offered. And so the richest man in the world ended up as a thoughtful servant at the side of the man who had taken everything from him, living proof of his own ignored lesson. With Croesus now folded into the Persian story, our restless investigator turns his attention fully onto the conqueror himself, this Cyrus who toppled his own grandfather, broke the unbreakable cavalry with camels, and was assembling the largest empire the world had yet seen. Because to understand how Lydia fell, we now have to understand where this Persian whirlwind came from, and his beginnings are every bit as strange, prophecy-haunted, and improbable as anything Croesus ever lived through. The origins of Cyrus read less like the biography of a future emperor, and more like the plot of a folk tale, complete with an ominous dream, a baby marked for death, and a grandfather who really should have known better than to mess with destiny. The man who ruled the Medes before the Persians rose up was named Astyages, and he happened to be Cyrus's grandfather, which already tells you this is going to be an awkward family story. Astyages had a dream that his daughter would one day produce an heir who would overshadow and eventually overthrow him. Now, a reasonable person hearing such a dream might simply resolve to keep an eye on the grandkids. Astyages, being a king and therefore allergic to subtlety, decided the safest course was to make sure the baby never grew up at all. When his daughter gave birth to Cyrus, he handed the infant to a trusted nobleman named Harpagus, with instructions to dispose of the child quietly. Harpagus, to his credit, had no stomach for killing a royal baby with his own hands, so he passed the unpleasant job down the chain to a herdsman, which is the time-honoured ancient method of avoiding responsibility by delegating it to someone poorer than you. But the herdsman and his wife, who had just suffered the loss of their own newborn, could not bring themselves to abandon a healthy child. They raised Cyrus as their own and presented their dead baby in his place, fooling everyone and quietly derailing the king's entire plan. The boy grew up among shepherds, blissfully unaware that he was royalty, until his natural bossiness gave him away. The story goes that while playing a game of pretend king with the other children, he ordered them around with such authority and punished a disobedient noble's son so confidently that word of this remarkably commanding farm boy eventually reached Astyages, who took one look at him and recognized his own bloodline staring back. The truth came out, and Astyages was furious, mostly at Harpagus for failing to carry out the order years earlier. The punishment he inflicted on Harpagus in return was so monstrous and cruel that it is best left to the imagination, but the upshot is straightforward enough. He turned a once loyal nobleman into a man nursing a quiet, patient, and absolutely murderous grudge. Harpagus spent years waiting for his moment, and when Cyrus had grown into a man and gathered the Persians around him, Harpagus, by then a general in the Median army, secretly threw his support behind the young upstart at the decisive moment. Astyages found his own troops switching sides mid-rebellion, lost his throne, and discovered the hard way that the dream he had spent a lifetime trying to outrun had simply walked up and collected him anyway. The grandson he had tried to erase now wore the crown, which is roughly the most on-the-nose lesson about the futility of fighting fate that history has ever handed out. With the Medes absorbed and his power base secured, Cyrus did not stop. He turned out to be one of those rare conquerors with an appetite that genuinely never seemed to fill, and he set about welding together the largest empire the world had yet seen, the realm later known as the Achaemenid Persian Empire. What made him unusual, and what helped his empire hold together rather than splinter the moment he turned his back, was a knack for ruling that did not rely purely on terror. Where many conquerors of the age made a point of stamping out the gods, languages, and traditions of the people they swallowed, Cyrus tended to leave them be. Conquered peoples were generally allowed to keep their own customs, worship their own gods, and carry on their lives more or less as before, provided they paid their dues and caused no trouble. It was, by the brutal standards of the time, a remarkably light touch, and it earned him a reputation for a kind of clemency that his later reputation as a bloodthirsty tyrant, the one Tomyris would eventually fling back in his face, does not entirely fit. The truth, as usual, was more complicated than either legend. He could be generous to those who submitted and merciless to those who did not, and he understood that an empire ruled by resentment alone tends not to last. We already saw how Lydia and its golden king fell to him through camels and an unguarded cliff, and Croesus, the wise prisoner, now rode along in his entourage offering counsel. But Lydia was just one trophy in a collection that kept expanding in every direction. Cyrus stitched together peoples and territories at a pace that left the rest of the world scrambling to understand what was happening, and before long there was only one prize left that could truly crown his reputation: the most legendary city on earth, a place so famously fortified that taking it would put his name in a league of its own. That city was Babylon. It is worth pausing on what fell into Persian hands along the way, because it quietly sets the stage for everything still to come in this larger story. When Lydia collapsed, the wealthy Greek cities along the coast of Asia Minor, the ones earlier Lydian kings had spent generations pressuring, suddenly found themselves with a new and far larger master. Cyrus dispatched his commanders, including that same Harpagus who had once helped topple Astyages, to bring these Greek communities to heel one by one. Some resisted and were besieged into submission, A few performed dramatic acts of defiance, and one or two reportedly chose to abandon their cities entirely and sail off to start over elsewhere rather than live under Persian rule. The point is that, almost as an afterthought to his grander conquests, Cyrus folded a sizable chunk of the Greek world into his empire. Those subjugated coastal Greeks, simmering with resentment under foreign governors, would one day strike a match that lit a fire reaching all the way to the heart of Greece itself. But that is a reckoning for much later. For now, the Greeks of the coast were simply one more line item in an ever-growing imperial ledger, and Cyrus had his eyes fixed on a far more glittering prize to the south. Babylon was, by the standards of the ancient world, or honestly any world, absurd. According to the account, it sat on a vast square plain, and around it ran walls of a scale that sounds like exaggeration, until you remember the people building them had nothing better to do with a few 100,000 labourers. The outer fortifications were said to stretch for a circuit of roughly 60 miles, walls thick enough to turn a chariot around on top of them, and tall enough to make any attacker reconsider their life choices from a great distance. Beyond the walls lay a deep, wide moat, and the gates set into the defences were made of bronze, gleaming and heavy and thoroughly intimidating. Running straight through the middle of the city was the great river Euphrates, dividing Babylon into two halves and supplying it with water, which seemed like a tremendous strategic advantage and would, in a delicious twist, turn out to be the exact thing that doomed it. A city that close to a river feels secure right up until someone clever decides to do something unexpected with the river. Inside those walls, the city was laid out with a regularity that impressed our investigator, the streets running in straight lines, many of them ending at the riverbank. Where each of these streets met the water, there was a small gate of bronze set into a lower wall that ran along the river through the heart of the city, and these river gates could be shut to seal the inhabitants off from the water entirely. In theory, even if an enemy somehow got into the riverbed, the people had only to close these inner bronze gates, and they would be perfectly safe behind a second line of defence. In practice, this only worked if someone remembered to close them, which, as we are about to see, was a detail the celebrating Babylonians neglected at the worst possible moment. The city also boasted a colossal sacred tower at its centre, a massive stepped structure rising in tiers with a shrine at the very top, the kind of monument that takes generations and an unhealthy obsession with height to build. It was, in every sense, a city designed to impress and to intimidate, and for a very long time it succeeded at both. Getting to Babylon, however, involved one of the more entertaining detours in the whole Persian campaign, and it tells you everything about the personality of a man who genuinely believed his will should extend to the natural world. On the march, the army had to cross a river called the Gind, and during the crossing, one of the sacred white horses that travelled with the expedition, animals considered holy and reserved for the gods, was swept off its feet by the current and drowned. Cyrus, rather than accepting that rivers are wet and horses are not great swimmers, took the loss as a personal insult delivered by the river itself. So he declared war on the water. He announced that he would humble the Gind so thoroughly that in future even a woman could cross it without getting her knees wet, and then he stopped his entire campaign of imperial conquest to make good on the threat. He set his army to digging, and they carved the single river into a network of around 360 separate channels, draining its power until it was a feeble trickle. He spent an entire summer punishing a body of water for the crime of being deep, which is the sort of project that really makes you appreciate the focus of a man who answers to absolutely no one. The river was duly humiliated, the gods were presumably satisfied, and only then did Cyrus get back to the actual business of conquering Babylon, having lost a whole season to a grudge against geography. When he finally reached the great city, even Cyrus could see that storming those colossal walls head-on was a recipe for a very long and very pointless siege. The Babylonians, for their part, were not especially worried. They had stockpiled years of provisions, confident that no army could ever breach their defences, and they settled in to wait out the Persians in comfort, which is generally the moment in any story when overconfidence starts sharpening its knife. But Cyrus had already noticed what everyone else had overlooked, which was that the river flowing through the city was an entrance hiding in plain sight. He stationed part of his force where the Euphrates flowed into Babylon and part where it flowed out, and then he diverted the river. He had his men dig channels to redirect the water into a nearby low-lying basin, a marshy depression, until the level of the river dropped low enough for a man to wade across the riverbed. With the water reduced to roughly thigh height, his soldiers simply walked into Babylon along the exposed channel, slipping under the mighty walls through the one gap the defenders had never thought to guard. And here is the detail that turns a clever military maneuver into pure dark comedy. Babylon was so enormous, and the Babylonians were so utterly convinced of their own safety that they did not even notice their city was falling. The story goes that there happened to be a festival underway, so while the Persians were quietly seizing the outer districts, the people in the central neighbourhoods were busy dancing, drinking, and celebrating, completely oblivious to the invasion already in progress a few streets over. By the time word spread that enemy soldiers were inside the walls, it was far too late to organise a defence. The river gates that should have sealed off the waterway, those bronze barriers along the inner wall, had been left standing open in the careless mood of the festival, so there was nothing to stop the Persians once they had waded in. The greatest fortress on earth, with its 60-mile walls and its bronze gates and its years of stockpiled food, was taken by an army that walked in through the plumbing while the residents were at a party. There is no monument to overconfidence quite as perfect as that. With Babylon in hand, Cyrus now ruled a genuinely staggering collection of peoples, and this is exactly the kind of moment our wandering investigator loved, because it gave him an excuse to compare the customs of the conquerors with those of the conquered. Two cultures that could hardly have been more different. The Persians, in his telling, had some habits that struck the Greek mind as refreshingly sensible, and others that were simply baffling. For one thing, they did not build temples or carve statues of their gods, and they considered it rather foolish that other peoples imagined the divine in human shape. Instead, they climbed to the tops of mountains to make their offerings to the heavens, which is at least a scenic approach to worship. They also placed an extraordinary value on telling the truth, regarding lying as one of the most disgraceful things a person could do, and just below lying on their list of shameful behaviours was being in debt, on the logic that a man who owes money is eventually forced to lie about it. An entire culture treating a poor credit score as a moral failing is frankly ahead of its time. But the Persian custom that delighted our historian most, and the one that has stuck with readers ever since, concerned how they made important decisions. When the Persians had a weighty matter to settle, they would debate it thoroughly while thoroughly drunk, hashing out the issue over a great deal of wine. Then, the following day, sober and presumably nursing a collective headache, they would revisit the very same question and reconsider their conclusion with clear heads. A decision was only adopted if it survived both rounds, the wine-soaked debate and the morning after review. The reverse worked too. Anything decided while sober was re-examined while drunk before being finalised. The reasoning, apparently, was that wine loosened a man up enough to say what he really thought, while sobriety kept him from following that honesty straight off a cliff. It is, when you think about it, a surprisingly thoughtful system for balancing courage and caution, and considerably more rigorous than many decisions get made under today. The Persians had other habits our investigator found worth noting. They raised their sons on 3 core skills and not much else, teaching boys from the age of 5 to ride a horse, to use a bow, and to tell the truth, a curriculum admirably free of clutter. In fact, children were kept away from their fathers entirely until that age, so that if a child happened to die young, the loss would not wound the father too deeply, which is either coldly practical or quietly heartbreaking depending on your mood. When 2 Persians met in the street, they greeted each other according to rank in a very specific way. Equals kissed each other on the lips, a man of slightly lower standing was kissed on the cheek, and only those far beneath in status had to make do with a bow, the whole encounter functioning as an instant silent ranking of who outranked whom. They were also, by his account, remarkably eager to adopt the customs of other peoples whenever those customs struck them as better than their own, happily borrowing foreign dress because they judged it more handsome than their native clothing, and picking up habits from every nation they encountered. For all their pride, in other words, the Persians were enthusiastic cultural magpies, which is a rather endearing trait in a people otherwise busy conquering everyone around them. The Babylonians, meanwhile, had customs of their own that ranged from the genuinely ingenious to the deeply alarming. The one our investigator admired most was a marriage practice that he considered the cleverest of all their arrangements, even though it had apparently fallen out of fashion by the time he was writing it down. Once a year, in each district, all the young women who had reached marrying age were gathered together in one place, and an auctioneer would put them up for marriage one at a time. The most sought-after women were offered first, and wealthy men competed to pay the highest price to marry them, with the money going into a communal pot. Then, once the most prized matches had been bid away, the process reversed. The women whom no one was eager to pay for were offered alongside a portion of that collected money, essentially providing them with a dowry funded by the high prices the others had fetched. In this way, the desirable matches financed the marriages of the less fortunate, and in theory everyone ended up paired off without anyone left stranded. Our historian thought this redistribution was a stroke of social genius, which it arguably was, however uncomfortable the auction block framing sounds to modern ears. Another Babylonian habit was a great deal more practical and a great deal less appealing. They had, by this account, no doctors at all. So when someone fell ill, rather than consulting a physician, the sick person would be carried out and laid in the public marketplace, where passers-by were obligated to stop, inquire about the symptoms, and offer advice based on whether they themselves or anyone they knew had ever suffered something similar and recovered. Nobody was permitted to simply walk past a sick person in silence. It was crowdsourced medicine, the ancient equivalent of posting your symptoms online and trusting the collective wisdom of strangers with all the reliability that implies. As for their dead, the Babylonians preserved bodies in honey before burial, which at least kept things tidy, and they had a number of other customs our investigator dutifully recorded with the faintly raised eyebrow of a man who has seen a lot of strange things and is no longer easily shocked by any of them. One Babylonian invention genuinely charmed him, and it concerned how goods reached the great city by water. The boats that came down the river to Babylon were round, built like a circular basket of wood and stretched hide, with no prow or stern to speak of, looking less like a vessel and more like a floating shield. Merchants would load these tubby little craft with cargo, often jars of wine, along with a live donkey or two, and let the current carry them downstream to the city. Once they arrived and sold off their goods, they would also sell the wooden frame of the boat, load the now folded hides onto the donkeys, and walk back upstream by land, since the strong current made it impossible to row such an awkward shape against the flow. Then they would build a fresh boat and do the whole thing again. It was a clever, frugal, one-way shipping system, and the mental image of a merchant strolling home beside a donkey, loaded with his own deflated boat, is exactly the kind of small human detail that makes these ancient accounts feel suddenly, vividly real. For all his conquests and all the fascinating peoples now under his rule, though, Cyrus was still a man, and the recurring lesson of this entire saga is that no one, not even the man who toppled empires and bullied rivers, gets to call himself safe while he still draws breath. Croesus had learned that the hard way on his pyre, and now it was the conqueror's turn. After Babylon, Cyrus set his sights on a fierce nomadic people far to the northeast called the Massagetae, a hardy folk of the open steppe who fought on horseback and recognized no master. They were ruled, at this point, by a widowed queen named Tomyris, who had taken the throne after her husband's death and ran her people with a sharp and unsentimental competence. Cyrus, ever the empire builder, decided he wanted her lands too. The Massagetae themselves were a people very much unlike the settled city dwellers Cyrus had been collecting. They lived on the open plains beyond the river, fought both on horseback and on foot, and were famous as deadly archers. Their habits, as recorded by our investigator, marked them as a folk of a harder and older world. They worshipped only the sun, the single god they recognized, and to it they sacrificed horses, on the reasoning that the swiftest of all creatures was the fitting offering for the swiftest of all the gods. They knew nothing of farming and lived instead on their herds and on fish from the river, and in their land gold and bronze were plentiful while silver and iron were unknown, so their weapons and ornaments gleamed with copper and gold rather than the iron the Persians relied on. They were, in short, exactly the sort of free, fierce, unfamiliar people who tend to give expanding empires far more trouble than they expect, a lesson the Persians were about to learn at terrible cost. His first approach was diplomatic, or at least dressed up as diplomacy. He sent word proposing marriage to Tomyris, presenting it as a flattering offer of union. Tomyris, however, was nobody's fool. She saw immediately that he was not interested in her hand but in her kingdom, that the proposal was simply a polite costume for annexation, and she sent his envoys packing with a firm refusal. So Cyrus dropped the pretense and prepared to take by force what he could not obtain by flattery, marching his army to the great river that separated his territory from hers and beginning to build a bridge of boats to cross it. The era's preferred icebreaker for an unwilling neighbour was, apparently, an invasion. Tomyris, watching this military build-up on her doorstep, sent Cyrus a message that was as fair as it was direct. She told him to stop labouring over his bridge and instead make a clean choice. He could withdraw his army a 3-day march back into his own land, allow her forces to cross the river unmolested, and then meet her in battle on Persian soil. Or, if he preferred to fight on her ground, he should pull his own troops back the same distance and let her army cross to face him. She offered him the choice of battlefield, which was a genuinely sporting gesture from someone who very much did not have to be sporting about it. Cyrus called a council to decide which option to take, and most of his advisors leaned toward letting Tomyris cross into Persian territory, on the sensible logic that fighting on home ground had its advantages. But then his resident expert on the downfall of overconfident kings spoke up. Croesus, who had every reason to understand how pride leads great men into disaster, advised against the cautious choice. He argued that for Cyrus, the king of kings, to pull back and yield ground would be humiliating, an admission that he feared a woman and her tribesmen, and that such a retreat would damage his standing. Better, Croesus suggested, to cross into the enemy's land and fight there. But he had a further idea, a trick, and this is the moment the advice curdles into the bait for a trap, in the grand tradition of this entire story. Croesus knew that the Massagetæ lived a hard, simple life, and were unaccustomed to the luxuries of Persia, including wine. So he proposed that the Persians prepare a lavish feast in their camp, set out enormous quantities of food and especially wine, and then leave the weakest portion of the army behind to guard it, while the main force withdrew nearby. The Massagetæ, he reasoned, would fall upon this abandoned banquet, gorge themselves on the unfamiliar wine, and drink themselves into helplessness, at which point the Persians could return and overwhelm them with ease. It was a cynical, clever plan that weaponized hospitality itself, and Cyrus liked it. The trap was set, and it worked exactly as Croesus had predicted, which in this saga is rarely a good sign for anyone involved. A detachment of the Massagetæ, led by Tomyris' own son, a young man named Spargapeses, came upon the seemingly abandoned Persian camp and its feast. They killed the small guard left behind, then sat down to enjoy the spoils, and the wine did precisely what wine does to people who have never built up a tolerance for it. The warriors ate and drank until they collapsed into a stupor, and that was when the main Persian force swept back in. They overwhelmed the incapacitated nomads, killing many and taking many more prisoner, and among the captured was Spargapeses himself, the queen's son, snared not by superior fighting but by a banquet and a hangover. When Tomyris learned what had happened, that her son had been taken not in honest battle, but through a deceitful trick involving wine, she was incandescent. She sent Cyrus a furious message demanding that he release her son and leave her country, warning him that he had won nothing honourable and that he should be satisfied and withdraw before things went further. She made it clear that if he did not, she would give him more bloodshed than even he could stomach. Cyrus ignored her completely. Meanwhile, her son, Spargapeses, had sobered up in captivity and come to understand the full humiliation of his situation, that he, the prince of a proud free people, had been captured while drunk on a foreigner's trick rather than fighting like a warrior. He could not bear the shame of it. He persuaded his captors to free him from his bonds, and the moment he was loose, overwhelmed by disgrace, he took his own life. The trick had not only beaten the Massagetæ, it had cost the queen her child. Now Tomyris was no longer merely an insulted ruler. She was a grieving mother with an army and a vow, and she gathered the full strength of her people to come for Cyrus. There is a haunting detail that belongs here, one more entry in this story's long catalogue of warnings that arrive precisely on time and are understood far too late. On the very night before the decisive fighting, while still camped in the enemy's land, Cyrus is said to have had a dream in which he saw the eldest son of one of his noblemen, with great wings sprouting from his shoulders, one wing casting its shadow over Asia and the other over Europe. Cyrus woke convinced the dream was a warning that this young man was plotting to seize his throne, and he sent word home ordering the youth's father to keep a close watch on his son. He had completely misread it, of course, in the grand tradition of everyone in this saga who receives a divine hint. The dream was not about a plot against his life that night. It was a glimpse of the distant future, of a man who would indeed one day rule an empire spanning 2 continents, but only long after Cyrus was gone and could do nothing about it. Cyrus spent his final hours guarding against the wrong threat entirely, which is by now a depressingly familiar pattern. The battle that followed was, in the judgment of our historian, among the most savage and hard-fought ever waged between peoples outside the Greek world, a brutal clash of 2 determined forces with no quarter asked or given. The 2 armies first exchanged volleys of arrows until their supplies ran out, then fell upon each other with spears and blades in close, grinding combat that lasted a long time, with neither side willing to yield. But in the end, the Massagetæ held the field. The mighty Persian army, the force that had toppled the Medes and the Lydians and walked into impregnable Babylon, was broken on the steppe, and Cyrus himself, the king of kings, the man who had bent rivers and swallowed nations, was killed in the fighting. Tomyris had promised him his fill of blood, and she was a woman who kept her promises. After the battle, the story goes, she searched among the fallen until she found the body of Cyrus, and she carried out the grim vow she had sworn. She had brought with her a skin filled with human blood, and into it she plunged the head of the conqueror, telling his lifeless remains that since he had thirsted so greatly for blood throughout his life, she would now let him drink his fill of it. It is a savage, unforgettable image, the kind of vengeance that belongs to the oldest and rawest layer of human storytelling, and it served as the final, terrible punctuation on the life of one of history's greatest empire builders. The man who could not stop conquering had finally found the one opponent he could not overcome, and she happened to be a widowed queen he had underestimated because of who she was. So the great Cyrus, founder of a world-spanning empire, the unstoppable force who had reduced the richest king alive to a humble advisor and the proudest city on earth to a conquered district, met his end on a distant frontier at the hands of a woman defending her home and avenging her son. The lesson that Solon had once tried to press upon Croesus had now claimed the conqueror as well. No amount of power, no length of unbroken success, no list of toppled rivals can secure a man against the turn of fortune while he still lives. Cyrus had perhaps come closer than anyone to seeming invincible, and in the end his story closed exactly the way these stories always seem to, with a proud ruler discovering too late the limit he was certain did not apply to him. His death did not end the empire he had built, of course. The vast machine of conquest he had assembled passed into the hands of his son, a man whose reign would carry the Persian story into a new and stranger land, down toward the ancient kingdom of Egypt with its temples and its tombs and its endless mysteries. That son would prove to be a very different ruler from his father, lacking Cyrus's instinct for restraint and possessing a temper that would, in time, tip him into something close to madness. But before we follow the Persians into Egypt at sword point, our investigator does something he rarely had the chance to do with Lydia or Babylon. He goes to Egypt himself, in person, to walk its riverbanks and question its priests firsthand, and it is precisely there, to the gift of a great river and the customs of the people who lived along it, that our investigator turns his curious gaze next, having followed the Persians as far as the steppe and watched their founder fall. Unlike the empires he reconstructed from second-hand reports and old soldiers' memories, Egypt was a place our investigator could actually go and poke around in for himself, and poke around he did. He travelled down to the great temple city of Memphis, sat with the priests who guarded centuries of records, peppered them with questions, measured monuments, and generally behaved like the world's most enthusiastic tourist with a notebook. And the very first thing he understood about Egypt, the insight that frames everything else, was that the entire civilization owed its existence to one river. He famously declared Egypt to be the gift of the Nile, and he meant it almost literally. Without the river, the land would be nothing but baking desert, uninhabitable and empty. The Nile not only supplied the water, but through its annual flooding, laid down a fresh layer of rich black silt across the fields every single year, fertilizing the soil for free. The Egyptians, in other words, lived on the generosity of a river that did all the hard agricultural work for them, which our investigator found both miraculous and slightly unfair to every other farmer in the world struggling with ordinary dirt. This flooding was, to a visitor from Greece, completely backwards. Most rivers he knew rose in winter from rain, and shrank in the dry heat of summer. The Nile did the exact opposite, swelling and overflowing in the height of summer, when not a drop of rain fell, then receding in the cooler months. To a Greek mind this was baffling, and our investigator devoted real energy to puzzling out why a river would behave so contrarily. He worked through several theories floating around at the time, including one that blamed melting snow somewhere far to the south, which he personally rejected on the reasonable grounds that the land the Nile flowed through was scorching hot and notably snow-free, so where exactly was all this snow supposed to be coming from? He never did crack the real answer, which involves monsoon rains falling on distant highlands far beyond anywhere he could reach. But the important thing is that he asked, reasoned, and rejected bad explanations rather than simply shrugging and crediting a god, which for the era was practically revolutionary. He went further still and made an argument about the very land of Egypt that was, for his time, genuinely sharp scientific thinking. He noticed that the broad triangular region near the river's mouth, the area where the Nile fanned out into many channels before reaching the sea, was made of soft black soil quite unlike the surrounding desert, and he reasoned that this whole expanse must have been built up gradually over countless ages by the silt the river deposited each year. In effect, he concluded, a large portion of Lower Egypt was a recent gift, land that the Nile had manufactured out of mud where there had once been open water. He backed this up by pointing to seashells he had observed lying on hills well inland, and to the salty crust that appeared on the ground, taking these as signs that the sea had once reached much farther in. It is a strikingly modern line of reasoning, the kind of conclusion a geologist might reach, arrived at by a curious man simply looking carefully at the dirt under his sandals and refusing to accept that things had always looked the way they did. Not bad for someone working without a single scientific instrument beyond his own eyes. The deeper he went into Egyptian life, the more he became convinced he had wandered into a world that did everything the opposite of how the Greeks did it, as if the entire country had been designed by someone determined to flip every familiar custom on its head. In Egypt, he reported, it was the women who went out to the markets and ran the trading and business, while the men stayed home and did the weaving, and even the weaving was done backwards, with the Egyptians pushing the thread downward instead of upward. Sons were under no obligation to support their aging parents if they did not wish to, but daughters were required to, the reverse of Greek expectation. People ate their meals outdoors in the streets but attended to private bodily matters indoors, which struck him as exactly upside down from sensible Greek practice. The priests shaved their entire bodies, where elsewhere a full head of hair and a beard signalled dignity. Item after item, the country presented itself as a kind of mirror image, and he relayed it all with the delight of a man who has discovered that everything he assumed was natural and universal turns out to be merely local habit. The Egyptians, for their part, were thoroughly convinced that they were the oldest people on the face of the earth, a claim they apparently held with great confidence until one particular pharaoh decided to actually test it. The ruler in question, the same Psammetichus whose bottomless well story we will get to, supposedly wanted to settle the question of which nation had existed first, and he devised an experiment that is equal parts ingenious and slightly cruel. He took 2 newborn infants from ordinary parents and handed them over to a shepherd with strict instructions that no one was ever to speak a single word in their presence. The babies were to be raised among the goats in total verbal silence, and the pharaoh would wait to see what language the children spoke first, on the theory that whatever word they produced on their own, untaught, must belong to the original and oldest tongue of humankind. After 2 years of this linguistic isolation experiment, the story goes, the children ran up to the shepherd one day with their hands out, repeating a word that sounded like the term for bread in the language of a neighbouring people called the Phrygians. On this slender evidence, the Egyptians reluctantly conceded that the Phrygians, not themselves, must be the more ancient nation, having apparently lost their own contest on a technicality involving 2 toddlers and a goat pen. It is, by any measure, a deeply unscientific way to settle a question of national pride, but you have to admire the willingness to put the matter to the test, rather than simply insisting on the answer they wanted. In a few areas, our investigator quietly admitted, the Egyptians had simply organised things better than the Greeks. Their calendar, for one, struck him as far more rational than the muddled system back home, where the Greeks were forever fiddling with their months and shoving in extra days to keep the seasons from drifting. The Egyptians had settled on a clean arrangement of 12 months of 30 days each, with 5 additional days tacked on at the end of the year, producing a tidy and consistent count that did not require constant correction. He gave the Egyptians full credit for working out the length of the year by observing the stars, calling their method superior, which from a Greek was a notable concession. They also wrote in 2 different scripts, one sacred and ornate, used for religious and formal matters, and one more everyday and practical for ordinary business, and in another of those upside-down quirks he loved. They wrote moving from right to left while insisting, somewhat cheekily, that it was the Greeks who wrote backwards. From the Egyptian point of view, naturally, their own way was the correct one, and everyone else was doing it wrong, which is a conviction every culture seems to share about its own habits. Then there were the animals, And this is where a modern audience tends to perk up, because the Egyptian relationship with the creatures around them was intense by any standard. The Egyptians, he explained, considered a great many animals sacred, and they took this seriousness to lengths that astonished him. Cats in particular held an exalted status. They were so cherished that when a cat died a natural death in a household, every human in that home would shave off their eyebrows as a sign of mourning, which is a level of grief most people today reserve for, at most, a beloved family member rather than the family pet. And harming a cat was no small matter. Causing the death of one, even accidentally, could provoke a furious mob, which gives you some sense of how a careless visitor might want to watch his step. Dogs, when they died, prompted the household to shave their entire bodies, and various other creatures had their own sacred standing, including certain goats and bulls and birds. Killing one of these sacred animals on purpose was treated as a grave crime. The Egyptians, it seems, had simply decided that a remarkable share of the animal kingdom deserved more respect than most cultures granted, and they committed to that decision with their whole hearts, and occasionally their eyebrows. The river itself teemed with creatures that fascinated him, none more than the crocodile, an animal he described with the breathless curiosity of someone who had clearly never seen anything like it back home. He noted that in some parts of Egypt the crocodile was held sacred and even kept as a sort of pampered temple pet, adorned with jewellery and fed choice food, while in other regions the locals took the entirely opposite view and hunted the things for dinner, which tells you that even within one country, opinions on whether a giant river reptile is a god or a meal could vary wildly by postcode. He passed along a charming and surprisingly accurate observation about a small bird that would hop fearlessly into the open mouth of a basking crocodile to pick out leeches and scraps from between its teeth, with the crocodile lying perfectly still and tolerating the dental service rather than snapping the helpful little bird in half. He also described with evident interest the methods used to hunt the dangerous beasts, and recorded plenty of other Nile wildlife besides, including the hippopotamus and various fish, all relayed with the wonder of a man encountering an entirely alien ecosystem and trying to fit it into a worldview built around Greek goats and olive trees. Not every creature he wrote about actually existed, mind you, and to his credit he often signalled as much. He passed along the legend of a marvellous bird called the phoenix, said to appear in Egypt only once every several hundred years, arriving from distant lands carrying the body of its dead parent encased in a ball of fragrant myrrh, which it would deposit at a sacred temple. He recorded the tale faithfully because the Egyptians told it to him, but he added in his characteristic way that he had not actually seen this bird himself except in paintings, and that the story struck him as rather hard to credit. That little note of doubt is exactly what separates him from a mere repeater of marvels. He would tell you the wild story, because it was part of what people believed, but he would also quietly let you know that he, personally, was not buying the part about a bird couriering its parent's corpse across continents in a scented package. A reasonable reservation, all things considered. But of all the Egyptian practices our investigator described, none has gripped people across the centuries quite like what they did with their dead. The Egyptians believed in preserving the body for the afterlife with a thoroughness that turned death into a major industry, and he laid out the process in detail that is equal parts fascinating and not for the squeamish. There were, he reported, 3 tiers of mummification available, essentially a budget option, a mid-range package, and a deluxe service for those who could afford the very best send-off, which is a startlingly modern bit of consumer tiering for a funeral. The premium method was the most elaborate. The embalmers would first remove the brain, drawing it out through the nostrils with an iron hook, a procedure that has made generations of readers wince in unison. The internal organs were taken out through an incision and treated separately. The body cavity was cleaned and packed with preservatives and fragrant substances, and then the whole body was laid in a natural salt called natron and left to dry out completely for around 70 days. After that drying period, the body was washed and wrapped in long bandages of fine linen, coated with gums, and handed back to the family ready for its tomb. The cheaper methods skipped the labour-intensive steps and were correspondingly less thorough, because then as now you got what you paid for, even at your own funeral. Their devotion to ritual extended far beyond the dead. Our investigator judged the Egyptians to be the most religious people he had ever come across, hemmed in on every side by ceremonies, prohibitions and festivals, with priests who washed themselves multiple times a day and observed an exhausting calendar of sacred obligations. He even floated the provocative idea, which would not have made him popular at home, that the Greeks had borrowed the names and aspects of many of their own gods from Egypt in the distant past, suggesting his proud countrymen owed more to these supposedly backward foreigners than they cared to admit. The Egyptians also held enormous festivals that drew huge crowds travelling by river, gatherings of celebration and feasting that he describes as among the largest and most boisterous he had encountered. On the matter of daily life, he noted their near obsession with cleanliness, the way they bathed constantly, drank from polished bronze cups scoured clean each day, wore freshly washed linen, and generally treated personal hygiene with a seriousness that would put many of his fellow Greeks to shame. They preferred, in his telling, to be clean rather than merely to look good, valuing being spotless over being stylish, which is a priority arrangement plenty of later civilizations never quite managed. Egyptian medicine, too, ran on a logic that struck him as remarkably advanced and faintly comical at the same time. Far from having no physicians at all, the Egyptians had specialists, and they took specialization to an extreme. Each doctor, he reported, treated one disease and one disease only. There were doctors for the eyes, doctors for the head, doctors for the teeth, doctors for the stomach, and doctors for ailments he could only vaguely categorize, every practitioner sticking rigidly to his own narrow corner of the body and refusing to wander into anyone else's. The result was a country positively swarming with hyper-focused specialists, which is either the height of medical sophistication or a bureaucratic nightmare for any patient whose problem did not fit neatly into a single category. Anyone today who has been bounced between three specialists who each insist the issue belongs to one of the others will recognize the system instantly. They also had a habit, he noted, of purging themselves regularly in the belief that most illness came from food, treating their own digestion with a suspicion bordering on hostility. Their diet itself was distinctive, built around a bread made from a grain the Greeks did not favour, supplemented by fish from the river, fowl, and a drink brewed from barley for the many regions that lacked vines, since this was not a land that ran on wine the way Greece did. They had firm rules about which foods were acceptable and which were forbidden on religious grounds, avoiding certain animals and plants entirely, so that a Greek guest might find half the familiar dinner menu quietly off the table for reasons of piety rather than taste. All of it added up, in his eyes, to a people who governed even their meals by an intricate web of custom and belief, leaving very little to mere personal preference. His travels up the Nile took him as far south as he could comfortably go, to a frontier island called Elephantine, near the first great rapids of the river, beyond which lay lands he could only describe from hearsay. Along the way he collected the kind of local stories a good traveller always does, including one about a supposedly bottomless source of the Nile that a long-ago ruler named Psammetichus had allegedly tried to measure. According to the tale he was told, the pharaoh had a rope of enormous length lowered into a spring said to feed the river, and it never reached the bottom, no matter how much line was paid out, suggesting the water came from depths beyond measuring. Our investigator passed this along with the careful neutrality of a man who suspects he is being fed a tall tale, but is too polite and too curious to refuse it, recording it as something he was told rather than something he believed. That habit of clearly separating what he saw with his own eyes from what he merely heard is precisely what keeps him trustworthy, even when his sources clearly were not. Naturally, no account of Egypt would be complete without its monuments, and here our investigator was genuinely awestruck, which for a proud Greek was no small admission. He described the building of the Great Pyramid raised by a pharaoh he called Cheops, and the numbers involved were staggering. The construction, he was told, occupied around 20 years, and required crews of labourers working in rotating shifts, with something like 100,000 men toiling at a time before being relieved by the next batch. He marvelled at the sheer scale of the stones, the precision of their fitting, and the organisational feat of feeding and managing such an enormous workforce for 2 decades. He passed along some unflattering stories about Cheops too, painting him as a harsh ruler who drained his people for his tomb, though much of that may have been the bitterness of later generations bleeding into the record rather than sober history. Whatever the truth of the pharaoh's character, the monument itself left him reaching for superlatives, and standing at its base, even a man who had seen golden Sardis and the walls of Babylon clearly felt the size of the thing pressing down on him. He was also keenly interested in how, exactly, such a mountain of stone had been assembled, and he passed along what his guides told him about the engineering. Before the pyramid itself could rise, he reported, the workers first had to build a long stone causeway to haul the enormous blocks up from the river, a preliminary project so massive that he considered it nearly as impressive as the pyramid it served. As for lifting the stones into place, he described a system of machines made of short timbers that raised each block from one level to the next, tier by tier, the blocks being walked up the structure stage by stage until they reached the top. Whether his account of the lifting devices is accurate has been argued over ever since, but the image of an army of labourers patiently ratcheting stones skyward for 2 decades captures the patience the thing required. His favourite detail, the one he could not resist repeating, was an inscription he claimed had been carved on the pyramid, recording the colossal sum spent merely on the radishes, onions and garlic consumed by the workforce. If true, the snack budget alone for the project ran to a fortune, which is the sort of gloriously mundane footnote that makes an ancient wonder feel suddenly, humanly real. Even the people who built the most famous tomb on Earth, it turns out, ran on vegetables and a truly heroic quantity of garlic. Yet the structure that impressed him most was not the famous pyramid at all, but a sprawling building he called the Labyrinth, and he insisted, in a remarkable bit of cultural honesty, that it surpassed anything the Greeks had ever constructed. This labyrinth was a vast complex containing, by his count, around 3,000 rooms, half of them above ground and half below. He was permitted to walk through the upper chambers and reported being amazed by the endless winding passages, the courtyards, the ceilings and walls of carved stone, the sheer disorienting scale of the place. The underground half he was not allowed to enter, as those chambers were said to hold sacred tombs and were off limits to a curious foreigner, which only deepened his fascination. He stated plainly that this single building represented more labour and skill than all the great works of the Greek world combined. A generous verdict from a man whose people were not exactly known for underselling their own achievements. When a proud Greek tells you the foreigners built something better than anything back home, you can be fairly sure the building was genuinely spectacular. Right beside this labyrinth lay another marvel that nearly defeated his ability to believe his own eyes, an enormous artificial lake of such size that he was convinced it had to be man-made, fed by channels connected to the Nile. He reported that the water level rose and fell with the river through these channels, and that rising out of the middle of this vast lake stood 2 great stone pyramids, each topped with a colossal seated statue, their lower halves submerged beneath the water. Whether the lake was truly dug entirely by human hands, as he was told, or was a natural feature that the Egyptians had merely improved and connected to the river, the scale of the whole arrangement struck him as almost beyond comprehension. A lake so large it looked like a sea, with pyramids planted in the middle of it like ornaments, was the kind of sight that left even a seasoned traveller quietly recalibrating his sense of what human beings were capable of building when they had a river, a few centuries, and an apparently unlimited supply of labourers and garlic. Among the many stories he gathered in Egypt, one stands out as pure entertainment, a clever caper tale he could not resist passing along, attached to a wealthy pharaoh he called Rampsinitus. This ruler was said to be so rich that he built a stone treasury to safeguard his fortune, but one of the builders quietly arranged a loose stone in the wall that could be removed and replaced, a secret entrance known only to himself. On his deathbed, the crafty builder shared the secret with his 2 sons, who promptly began helping themselves to the royal treasure through the hidden gap, mystifying the pharaoh, whose seals on the doors remained unbroken even as his gold steadily vanished. The king, baffled, set traps near the treasure, and on one nighttime visit one of the brothers was caught fast in a snare. Realizing he could not escape and not wanting his identity discovered to bring ruin on his family, he had his own brother do something drastic to keep him from being recognized, after which the brother slipped away. What follows is a whole escalating game of wits, with the pharaoh trying ever more elaborate schemes to identify and capture the impossibly resourceful thief, and the thief outsmarting him at every single turn. Eventually the king, half exasperated and half genuinely impressed, decided that anyone this cunning deserved a reward rather than a punishment, and offered the thief his daughter in marriage and a place of honour, on the logic that the Egyptians were the cleverest of peoples, and this man was the cleverest of the Egyptians. It is a delightful folk tale, the kind of underdog outwits the powerful story that shows up in every culture, and our investigator clearly enjoyed it as much as his readers have ever since. But woven through all this wonder and wealth and clever storytelling runs the same dark thread that has shadowed every chapter of this saga, the idea that fortune is borrowed, never owned, and that the gods have a particular distaste for anyone too obviously and too lastingly blessed. And nowhere does this theme appear more sharply than in the story of a ruler from the Greek island of Samos named Polycrates, which our investigator tucked into his Egyptian account because Polycrates had been an ally of an Egyptian pharaoh named Amasis. Polycrates was a man whose luck was almost embarrassing. Whatever he attempted succeeded. His fleets prospered, his enemies faltered, his every venture turned to profit, and his good fortune became so consistent and so total that it started to make people nervous, his royal Egyptian friend most of all. Amasis, watching his allies' uninterrupted run of success from across the sea, grew genuinely uneasy. He understood, in the way the wise figures of this story always seem to understand, that the divine powers do not tolerate a mortal who is too fortunate for too long. Sooner or later he believed such relentless good luck would be balanced by a catastrophe equal to all the blessings combined, and the bigger the streak, the worse the eventual reckoning. So Amasis wrote to his friend with some unusual advice. He suggested that Polycrates should deliberately introduce some misfortune into his own life, that he should take whatever he valued most, the single possession whose loss would grieve him deepest, and throw it away on purpose, sacrificing it so that he could experience a real sorrow and thereby satisfy the jealous attention of the gods before they decided to satisfy it themselves on a much larger scale. It was an oddly practical bit of theological risk management, the ancient equivalent of paying a small penalty now to avoid a ruinous one later. Polycrates, to his credit, took the warning seriously and decided to follow the advice. He owned a signet ring, a beautifully crafted emerald set in gold that he prized above all his other possessions. He boarded a ship, sailed out into deep water, and in full view of the crew flung this beloved ring far out into the sea, watching his single, most treasured object sink beneath the waves. He returned home in a state of genuine grief at the deliberate loss, which was exactly the point. He had manufactured a real sorrow, paid his dues to fate, and could now, in theory, rest easier knowing he had taken his medicine. For a few days the plan seemed to have worked beautifully, and then, in the kind of twist that this entire story specializes in, the universe declined to cooperate. About 5 or 6 days later, a fisherman caught a fish so large and so magnificent that he decided it was too fine to sell at market and ought instead to be presented as a gift to the ruler himself. He brought the splendid fish to Polycrates, who graciously accepted it and ordered it prepared for his table, and when his servants cut the great fish open in the kitchen, there, sitting in its belly, was the signet ring, the very emerald and gold treasure that Polycrates had hurled into the depths of the sea days earlier. The ring had come back to him. It had refused to stay lost. The servants, astonished, carried it straight to Polycrates, who recognized at once what it meant and reported the whole thing in a letter to his Egyptian friend. When Amasis read that the discarded ring had returned to its owner against all odds, he did not rejoice. He was, in fact, deeply alarmed, because he understood the message perfectly. The gods had refused to accept Polycrates' offering. They had sent the ring back to make it unmistakably clear that this man's run of fortune was not going to be allowed any small manageable correction. The reckoning, when it came, was going to be total, and there would be no buying it off with a single thrown ring. Amasis concluded that his friend was doomed, that no amount of cleverness could save a man so thoroughly marked out by excessive luck, and rather than wait around to share in the inevitable disaster, he formally dissolved their alliance and friendship, severing ties so that he would not be dragged down by the catastrophe he was now certain awaited Polycrates. It is a chilling moment, a friend essentially announcing in advance that he is abandoning ship because he can see the iceberg from miles off. And Amasis was right. Though our investigator saves the full grisly details of Polycrates' downfall for elsewhere in his account, the broad shape of it is clear enough and entirely in keeping with everything the story has been building toward. The man whose luck never failed was eventually lured away from the safety of his island by a treacherous offer of wealth and alliance, walked into a trap set by a powerful enemy, and met a thoroughly wretched and undignified end, far worse than the mere loss of any ring. The fortune that had seemed so unshakable evaporated the moment fate decided his account was due, and his story closed exactly as Solon had warned Croesus that all such stories must. No man, however blessed, however clever, however protected by an unbroken streak of success, can be called fortunate while he still lives, because the gods keep a longer ledger than any human can read, and they always, eventually, balance the books. So the chapter of Egypt, for all its marvels and its mummies and its upside-down customs and its clever thieves, comes back around to the same quiet truth that runs beneath the gold and the wonders. The pyramids will outlast the men who built them, the Nile will keep delivering its gift long after every pharaoh is dust, and the river of fortune that lifts a man impossibly high is the very same current that sooner or later carries him back down. Our investigator gathered all of this with his characteristic mixture of wide-eyed wonder and dry skepticism, recording the splendour of a great civilization while never once forgetting the lesson that splendour cannot save you. And it is in this frame of mind, having walked the riverbanks and questioned the priests and marvelled at the tombs, the son who inherited the vast empire Cyrus had assembled was named Cambyses, and if his father is remembered as a conqueror with a surprising streak of mercy, Cambyses earned a reputation at the opposite end of the spectrum entirely. He fixed on one great project above all others, the conquest of Egypt, the ancient land of pyramids and sacred cats that our investigator had just finished exploring, and it was in Memphis, questioning the priests and locals, that he gathered the strange and unsettling story of how it all unfolded. The Egyptians who lived through it had plenty to say about the Persian who came to rule them, and almost none of it was flattering. It is worth remembering that our investigator was hearing this version from the conquered, who had every reason to paint their foreign master in the darkest colours imaginable, so some of what follows may owe as much to Egyptian resentment as to sober fact. Still, even allowing for a generous helping of grudge, the portrait that emerges is of a man who genuinely seems to have come unglued, and the sheer consistency of the stories suggests there was a real and frightening truth somewhere underneath them. The reasons given for the invasion are a tangle of grudges, as these things usually are, but one popular version traced it back to a personal insult involving a marriage. Cambyses had supposedly requested an Egyptian princess, a daughter of the reigning pharaoh Amasis, the same Amasis who, as we saw, had wisely cut ties with his too lucky friend Polycrates. Amasis, reluctant to hand his daughter over to a foreign king who would treat her more as a concubine than a queen, tried to pull a fast one by sending a different young woman in her place, dressed up to pass as the princess. The substitution was eventually uncovered. The deception enraged Cambyses, and he decided that the proper response to being tricked over a bride was to invade and conquer the entire country, which is a somewhat disproportionate reaction to a dating mishap, but very much in keeping with the temperament he was about to reveal. Whatever the true cause, conquering Egypt was no simple matter, because between the Persian forces and the Egyptian heartland lay a brutal stretch of waterless desert that could swallow an army whole. This is where treachery entered the story, in the form of a man named Phanes. Phanes was a Greek from our investigator's own home region, who had served as a respected commander among the mercenaries in the Egyptian army, a capable and well-informed insider. For reasons of his own, some falling out with the pharaoh, he abandoned the Egyptian side and defected to Cambyses, carrying with him exactly the knowledge the Persians needed most. He explained how the army could survive the desert crossing by arranging an agreement with the desert-dwelling Arab king to supply water along the route, solving the single greatest obstacle to the invasion. One disgruntled insider with local knowledge, as so often in history, proved worth more than 10,000 soldiers. The arrangement with the desert Arabs gave our investigator an excuse to record some of their customs, and they fascinated him. To move water across the parched route for the advancing army, the Arabs were said to have filled the skins of camels with water and loaded them onto living camels, ferrying the precious liquid across the sands in the most resourceful way their environment allowed. He was even more taken with how these desert people made a solemn promise. When two parties wished to swear a binding oath, a third man would stand between them and make a small cut on the palm of each near the thumb, then take a thread from the garment of each and smear it with the drawn blood, anointing a set of sacred stones while invoking their gods. To the Arabs, an oath sealed in this manner was utterly inviolable, a bond no honourable person would dream of breaking. Our investigator, who had by now catalogued the wildly different ways that different peoples handled marriage, medicine, death, and decision-making, simply added oath-swearing to his ever-growing list of proof that there is no single natural way for humans to do anything, only the particular way each people happens to have settled on. The Egyptian mercenaries that Phanes had betrayed did not take his desertion lightly, and before the great battle they exacted a grim and terrible revenge upon the sons he had left behind, an act of vengeance carried out in full view of the two armies as a message to the traitor watching from the Persian lines. Our investigator records the episode soberly, as a stark illustration of the savage emotions that war unleashes, and it set the tone for a conflict that would be bitter on both sides. When the armies finally clashed at a place near the eastern edge of the Nile Delta, the fighting was fierce, but the Persians prevailed, and the Egyptians fell back in disarray. Egypt, the civilization that had endured for thousands of years, that had built the pyramids and buried its dead in honey, now passed under Persian control. One detail from that battlefield captures perfectly the kind of curious mind our investigator brought to everything he saw. Years later, walking among the old bones still lying where the dead had fallen, he noticed something peculiar. The skulls of the slain Persians were so thin and fragile that you could shatter one by tossing a small pebble at it, while the skulls of the Egyptians were so thick and hard that you could strike them with a rock and barely make a dent. Puzzled, he asked the locals to explain the difference, and the answer he was given was wonderfully practical. The Egyptians shaved their heads from early childhood, and went about bareheaded under the fierce sun so their skulls thickened and hardened from a lifetime of exposure. The Persians, by contrast, kept their heads covered with cloth from infancy, sheltering them from the sun and leaving the bones soft and brittle. Whether or not the explanation holds up to modern science, it is a perfect snapshot of the man, pausing in the middle of a battlefield to investigate the comparative durability of skulls, because he simply could not walk past an interesting question without prodding at it. After the conquest, Cambyses captured the new pharaoh, a young man named Semenotus, who had only recently succeeded his father Amasis, and here our investigator tells one of the most quietly devastating stories in the whole account, a tale about grief and the strange ways it surfaces. The conquest had not been entirely bloodless in its aftermath. When the Persians first approached the great city of Memphis, Cambyses sent messengers by ship to demand its surrender, but the people, still defiant, fell upon the envoys and killed them, an act that sealed the city's fate. Once Memphis was taken, Cambyses answered the killing of his messengers with the harsh reprisals customary for such defiance in that age, and it was in this grim climate, with noble Egyptian families paying the price for the city's resistance, that the captured pharaoh's own son found himself swept up among the condemned. Cambyses, wanting to test the captured king's spirit, arranged a series of humiliations and watched to see how he would react. First, he had the pharaoh's own daughter paraded past dressed as a slave, sent out with other noble girls to fetch water, weeping as they went, their fathers all watching helplessly. Semenotus, seeing his daughter degraded, said nothing, and only bowed his head to the ground in silence. Next came his young son, led past among a group of condemned young men marked for execution as a reprisal. Again the pharaoh watched without a word, his face frozen, betraying nothing. The watching Persians were baffled by his composure. But then, when an old man, a former companion and dinner guest of the pharaoh, now reduced to a beggar, shuffled past in the crowd, Semenotus suddenly broke down completely, weeping and calling out his friend's name and striking his own head in grief. When Cambyses heard of this, he was genuinely puzzled, and sent a messenger to ask why the king had stayed silent at the sight of his own ruined children, but wept at the sight of a mere beggar friend. Semenotus gave an answer that has echoed across the centuries. He explained that his own family's suffering was a sorrow far too great for tears, a grief beyond any possible expression, while the sight of an old companion fallen from comfort into beggary in his old age was a misfortune small enough to actually be wept over. It is a profound observation about the nature of human pain, that the deepest griefs often render us silent, while smaller, more comprehensible sorrows are the ones that finally crack us open. Even Cambyses, who was not exactly known for his sensitivity, was reportedly moved by the answer, and for a moment showed the captured king some mercy. For a moment. That mercy did not last, as mercy rarely did with Cambyses. He had apparently intended to keep the deposed pharaoh alive and even to make some use of him, but Semenotus, perhaps understandably unwilling to spend his life as the pet captive of the man who had humiliated his children, was later caught attempting to stir up his former subjects into rebellion against Persian rule. Once that plot came to light, his fate was sealed, and the last native pharaoh of an independent Egypt met his end as a prisoner, the final ruler of a line stretching back thousands of years extinguished under a foreign king. It was a quiet, almost anticlimactic, close to the long story of the pharaohs, the kind of unceremonious ending that history hands out far more often than the dramatic ones we tend to remember. Because it is roughly at this point that Cambyses, in the telling of the Egyptians who despised him, began his long slide into something that looked very much like madness. Our investigator, ever willing to consider more than one explanation, noted that some believed Cambyses had suffered since birth from a serious affliction, a condition that periodically seized his body and that people of the time regarded as a sacred or God-sent illness, and he suggested with notable fairness that a man whose body was so disordered might well have had a disordered mind to match. It is a strikingly compassionate aside for the era, an acknowledgement that what looked like pure wickedness might have had roots in genuine illness rather than simple evil. Whatever the underlying cause, the outward behaviour grew steadily more alarming. The first sign came when he turned his attention to the dead. He had the embalmed body of the late Pharaoh Amasis, the man who had supposedly tricked him over the marriage, dragged from its tomb so that he could subject the mummified remains to a series of indignities, abusing a corpse to vent a grudge against a man already safely beyond his reach. Then, dissatisfied, he ordered the body burned, which violated sacred beliefs on two fronts at once. The Egyptians were horrified because mistreating and especially burning the dead was an abomination to them, while the Persians themselves held fire to be sacred and considered it a defilement to feed a human body to the flames. In a single act of spite, Cambyses managed to trample the deepest taboos of both his own people and the ones he had just conquered, which takes a special kind of single-minded pettiness. This contempt for the sacred became something of a habit with him. He reportedly forced his way into temples that ordinary people, let alone foreigners, were forbidden to enter, and openly mocked the holy images he found inside, laughing at one revered statue because its squat, dwarfish form struck him as ridiculous rather than divine. He pried open ancient sealed tombs to examine the preserved bodies within, treating the resting places of the long dead as curiosities to be rifled through, with no regard for the horror this caused the people whose ancestors he was disturbing. To the Egyptians, every one of these acts was a fresh outrage, the behaviour of a man with no reverence for anything, and they piled up in their memory as evidence that this Persian king was not merely a harsh conqueror, but something genuinely unhinged, a person who took active pleasure in desecrating whatever others held holy. A conqueror who simply taxes you is one thing. A conqueror who breaks into your temples to giggle at your gods is quite another, and the Egyptians never forgave him for it. His judgment did not improve when he turned to fresh conquests. Cambyses set his sights on the lands to the south, on a distant and famously long-lived people often called the Ethiopians, said to dwell at the edge of the known world. Before invading, he sent spies disguised as a friendly embassy, bearing gifts of fine clothing, perfume, and other Persian luxuries, partly to scout the land and partly to size up its people. The men he chose for this errand were drawn from a coastal people known as the fish-eaters, selected for the eminently sensible reason that they could actually speak the language of the distant southerners, and so could serve as both spies and interpreters, which is at least a sign that one small corner of the planning was handled competently, even if everything else about the venture was not. The king of the long-lived Ethiopians, however, was no fool, and he saw straight through the diplomatic charade. He examined the gifts and was thoroughly unimpressed. He inspected the dyed purple cloth and the gold jewellery, and dismissed them as flimsy and deceptive things, and when shown the perfume he was equally unmoved. Then he did something marvellous. He handed the spies an enormous bow and challenged them to take it back to Cambyses with a message. When the Persians could string and draw a bow as mighty as this one with ease, the Ethiopian king said, then they might consider marching against his people, and until then they should be grateful the Ethiopians had not set their own ambitions on conquering anyone else. It was the ancient equivalent of receiving a polite invasion threat and responding by mailing back a piece of gym equipment, with a note reading, "Come back when you can lift this." The spies, for their part, brought back marvellous reports about the land and its people, and our investigator relayed them with obvious relish. These southern people were said to be the tallest and most handsome of all human beings, and to live extraordinarily long lives, many of them reaching well past 100 years. The secret, the spies were told, lay partly in their diet of boiled meat and milk, and partly in a remarkable spring whose water was so light and pure that nothing could float on its surface, and bathing in which left the skin glossy, and was credited with their long lives. They chose as their king whichever man was the tallest and strongest, on the sensible logic that the most physically impressive person should lead. a refreshingly straightforward approach to succession compared to the murderous family dramas playing out in Persia. They valued bronze above all other metals, the exact reverse of peoples who prized gold, and prisoners among them were said to be bound in chains of gold simply because gold was so common as to be the cheapest thing around for the purpose. Strangest of all, the spies described how these people preserved their dead by drying the bodies and encasing them in pillars of a clear, glass-like substance, so that the deceased could be kept on display, visible within their transparent monuments, for a year before being set up around the home and honoured. It was a vision of a distant, almost utopian people at the very rim of the world, and it stood in deliberate contrast to the cruelty and chaos that the supposedly civilized Persian king was about to unleash by attacking them. One detail in particular delighted our investigator enough that he set it down with care, a place the spies were shown called the Table of the Sun. This was said to be a meadow on the outskirts of the city, kept perpetually stocked with the boiled meat of various animals. By night, the story went, the officials of the city would quietly lay out the meat there, and by day anyone who wished could come and eat their fill, while the local belief held that the earth itself produced the bounty spontaneously, as a gift renewed each night. Whether the citizens genuinely believed their meadow grew dinner on its own, or simply enjoyed the pleasant fiction while the magistrates did the actual cooking, our investigator does not say, but he clearly relished the image of a public field that supposedly sprouted free meals. It was the kind of marvel that made the edges of the known world feel like a place where the ordinary rules of scarcity politely did not apply, which is rather the whole appeal of stories about faraway lands. Cambyses predictably did not take the hint. Enraged, he flew into a fury and ordered an immediate march against the Ethiopians, and here his impulsiveness curdled into genuine catastrophe. He set out without making remotely adequate provision for feeding his army across the long desert march, the kind of basic logistical planning that even a mediocre commander knows to arrange. The supplies ran out long before the army reached its destination. The soldiers first ate their pack animals, then resorted to scratching whatever scraps of vegetation they could find from the barren ground, and as the situation grew truly desperate in the empty wastes, the starving army was driven to extremities too grim to dwell on, the sort of horrors that overtake men with no food and no way home. Only when the disaster became undeniable did Cambyses finally order a retreat, and the shattered remnant of his force straggled back, having accomplished nothing except proving that you cannot conquer a distant land on an empty stomach and a bad temper. That was not even the only army he managed to lose. Around the same time, he dispatched a separate force of tens of thousands of soldiers across the desert to attack and plunder a famous oracle sanctuary, the renowned shrine of the god Ammon out in the western sands, reportedly because the oracle there had said things not to his liking, and he wanted it destroyed in revenge. Picking a fight with an oracle is, given everything we have seen about how oracles tend to have the last laugh in this story, an especially poor career move, and this army simply vanished. According to the story our investigator collected, the troops set out into the sands, made it part way to their destination, and were never seen again. The locals reported that while the soldiers were stopping to eat in the open desert, a tremendous windstorm swept down upon them, a wall of driven sand that buried the entire force where they stood, swallowing 50,000 men without a trace. Whether a sandstorm truly entombed an entire army, or whether they perished some other way and the storm became the legend, the result was a second military disaster, to set beside the Ethiopian fiasco, two armies squandered in the desert through one ruler's reckless ambition. Cambyses was rapidly becoming the kind of commander whose soldiers might reasonably wonder whether the enemy was really their biggest problem. When Cambyses returned to Memphis from his southern misadventures, he arrived to find the Egyptians in the middle of a joyful religious celebration, the people dancing and rejoicing in the streets. In his paranoid state, he immediately assumed the worst, convincing himself that the Egyptians were celebrating his military failures, mocking his defeats with a public party. In fact, as he was eventually told, the festivities had nothing to do with him at all. The Egyptians were celebrating the appearance of a new sacred bull, the living animal they revered as a god made manifest, a creature called Apis that they believed appeared only rarely, and was an occasion of enormous religious joy. This was no ordinary bull. To qualify as the divine Apis, a calf had to be born bearing a very specific set of natural markings, a particular pattern on its hide, and other distinguishing signs that the priests carefully verified, and the appearance of such a calf was treated as the god choosing to dwell among them in animal form. The discovery of a new Apis was therefore one of the most sacred events in Egyptian life, a cause for festivals and rejoicing across the land, which is precisely why the timing could not have been worse for a paranoid king returning from defeat and primed to take everything as a personal insult. Cambyses, however, refused to believe the explanation and flew into one of his rages. He demanded that the priests bring the sacred bull before him, and when they presented the holy animal, he drew his dagger and struck at it, wounding the creature in the thigh, treating the most sacred living symbol of Egyptian religion as nothing more than an ordinary beast. The wounded bull was carried away and later died of the injury, and to the Egyptians this act of sacrilege against their living god was the unforgivable crime that explained everything that followed. From that day, they said, Cambyses was truly and visibly mad, struck down in his wits as divine punishment for striking down their god. Whether you credit divine retribution or simply observe that he was already behaving erratically, the wounding of the Apis bull became the symbolic hinge on which his sanity finally gave way, and it will matter again before the chapter is done. After the Apis affair, the madness, as the accounts describe it, only deepened, turning inward against his own family and household. Cambyses had a younger brother named Smerdis, who had come along on the Egyptian campaign. Cambyses, it is said, grew consumed by suspicion and jealousy toward him, possibly fueled by a troubling dream in which he saw his brother seated on the royal throne with his head reaching the heavens, an omen he read as a warning that Smerdis intended to seize his crown. Acting on this fear, Cambyses sent his brother quietly back to Persia, and then dispatched a trusted agent to do away with him in secret, removing the perceived threat before it could materialize. The man he chose for this most sensitive of tasks was, by the account, that same loyal advisor Prexaspes, the one person discreet enough to be trusted with a royal murder. The killing was kept hidden, known only to a handful of people, a buried secret that, as we will see, would come back to haunt the empire in spectacular fashion. There is a bitter symmetry in the fact that the man trusted to secretly remove one of the king's relatives would later be forced to watch the same king kill his own child in front of him. A debt of grief that would not stay buried forever. For now, the important point is that Cambyses had murdered his own brother out of paranoid fear of a dream, which is rarely the decision of a stable mind. His treatment of his sisters was no better. In a break from ordinary custom, Cambyses had married two of his own sisters, and the story of what happened to one of them is told with the kind of grim, indirect care that our investigator used for delicate matters. By one account, this sister gently grieved over the fate of their murdered brother, or made a pointed comparison that wounded Cambyses' pride, using the image of a plant stripped of its parts to suggest how he had torn apart his own family. The criticism, however it was framed, enraged him, and his sister-wife did not survive his anger, becoming yet another member of his own household destroyed by his volatile temper. A man who murders his brother and his sister in short order is not generally regarded by the standards of any era as someone in full command of his faculties. There came a point when even Cambyses seemed dimly aware that people were whispering about his sanity, and his response to those whispers is perhaps the single most disturbing episode of all. He had a loyal and respected advisor, a man named Prexaspes, whose counsel he valued, and one day he asked this advisor bluntly what the Persians were saying about him behind his back. Prexaspes, choosing honesty, told him gently that the people admired him in most respects, but felt he was perhaps too fond of wine. Rather than taking the criticism to heart, Cambyses decided to disprove it by demonstrating that wine had in no way clouded his steadiness or his aim. He declared that if he could perform a feat of perfect precision, it would prove the people wrong and his faculties sharp. He then took up his bow, and with the advisor's own young son standing across the room, he loosed an arrow that struck the boy fatally, after which he triumphantly claimed this proved his hand and eye were as steady as ever, and that it was the Persians, not he, who had lost their judgment. It is an act of such cold horror that it needs no embellishment, and it stands as the bleakest proof imaginable that whatever sanity Cambyses had once possessed was now entirely gone. Prexaspes, for reasons of survival, was forced to swallow his grief and praise the shot, a moment of helpless submission that he would not forget. And so the reign of Cambyses curdled into a catalogue of cruelty, paranoia, and sacrilege, a ruler at war with his own family, his own subjects, the gods of two nations, and increasingly with reality itself. But the wheel of fate, which has turned on every powerful figure in this saga, was preparing to turn on him as well, and it would do so with the same dark irony that claimed Croesus and Cyrus before him. Word reached Cambyses, while he was still in Egypt, of an astonishing development back in the heart of his empire. A man had risen up and seized the throne, claiming to be none other than Smerdis, the very brother Cambyses had secretly killed. To Cambyses this was bewildering and terrifying. Either his brother had somehow survived and was now in open revolt, or someone was impersonating a dead man to steal the crown, and Cambyses could not at first be sure which. He soon pieced together that his brother was indeed dead, and that this Smerdis on the throne had to be an impostor, and he resolved to march home at once to crush the usurper and reclaim what was his. It was in the very act of preparing for this urgent journey that fate collected its due, and the manner of it ties the whole bloody chapter into a single grim knot. As Cambyses hurriedly mounted his horse to set off, his sword somehow slipped from its sheath, and the exposed blade struck him in the thigh, wounding him in precisely the same spot where he had struck the sacred Apis bull. The coincidence was not lost on him. He asked the name of the town where this had happened, and when he was told, the answer chilled him to the bone, because it connected to an old prophecy he had received long before. He had once been told by an oracle that he would die at a place called Ecbatana. Naturally, he had assumed this meant the great Median city of that name, far away in the empire's heartland, and he had reasoned that he would live to a ripe old age and only meet his end there in his comfortable capital. But the town where he now lay bleeding bore the very same name, a small and obscure place he had never expected to matter. The oracle, true to the pattern that has run through every prophecy in this story, had told the literal truth in a form perfectly designed to be misunderstood. Cambyses had spent his life fearing the wrong Ecbatana entirely. Realizing that his end had come, and in this place of all places, Cambyses is said to have finally recovered something like clarity in his last days, lamenting too late what his madness had cost him. He confessed publicly that he had indeed killed his brother Smerdis in secret, and that the man now sitting on the throne claiming to be Smerdis could therefore only be an impostor, and he begged the Persian nobles around him to take back the crown from the deceiver rather than let it stay in unworthy hands. But the wound festered, and Cambyses died there in that obscure town, having ruled an empire into chaos and leaving behind no children, no heir, and no clear successor. The son of the great Cyrus, who had set out to add Egypt to his father's collection, and had succeeded, ended his days childless and broken, undone by his own cruelty and a misread word from an oracle, exactly as so many proud rulers before him had been undone. The Persians themselves, looking back on the two reigns, were said to draw a simple and damning comparison. They remembered Cyrus as a father, a ruler who had been gentle and had worked for the good of his people, while they remembered Cambyses as a master, harsh and overbearing, caring for no one but himself. It is about as concise a verdict on a life as history offers, the difference between being mourned as a parent and merely endured as an owner. His confession, made on his deathbed to nobles who half suspected he was lying out of spite, did little good in the moment, because hardly anyone believed it. To most Persians, the man on the throne genuinely seemed to be Smerdis, the legitimate younger son of Cyrus, and Cambyses had such a reputation by then that his dying words were dismissed as one more bitter falsehood from a hated king. And so his death, rather than settling matters, threw the door wide open to one of the most extraordinary episodes of deception and conspiracy in the entire history, a tangle of false identities, a secret known to almost no one, and a small band of bold men who would have to decide the fate of the world's greatest empire by uncovering a lie. The man on the throne was not who he claimed to be, only a handful of people suspected the truth, and the question of who would rule the Persian Empire was about to be answered in the most unlikely way imaginable. The lie that had taken hold of the Persian throne while Cambyses was busy losing his mind in Egypt was an audacious one, and it worked precisely because so few people knew the truth. As we saw, the real Smerdis, the younger son of Cyrus, had been quietly disposed of on Cambyses' orders, a secret guarded by only a tiny handful. Into that gap of knowledge stepped two brothers, both belonging to the priestly class the Persians called the Magi, men of religious learning who held positions of trust in the royal household while Cambyses was away. One of these brothers happened to bear a striking physical resemblance to the murdered prince, and, in an almost suspiciously convenient detail, even shared his name, also being called Smerdis. The other brother, who managed the palace, hatched the scheme. Since the public did not know the genuine Smerdis was dead, why not simply install the look-alike brother on the throne, and announce that the king's own brother had taken power. To the ordinary Persian, it looked entirely legitimate. The beloved younger son of the great Cyrus had apparently claimed the crown, and people across the empire happily transferred their loyalty to him, even welcoming him because he promptly granted them a generous suspension of taxes and military service, which is a remarkably effective way to win over a population that has no idea its new ruler is an impostor priest. This was the situation when Cambyses died, and his deathbed confession that the man on the throne could not possibly be the real Smerdis was, as we noted, widely disbelieved, dismissed as the spiteful raving of a hated and dying king. So the false Smerdis ruled on, secure behind his pleasant tax cuts and the general assumption that he was who he claimed to be. There was, however, one rather large problem with maintaining a deception of this kind, which is that the more people who could potentially recognize you, the harder it becomes to keep the curtain closed. The impostor knew this, and he took care to stay largely out of sight, rarely summoning the leading nobleman to his presence and never leaving the safety of the palace, behaviour that began, in time, to strike the Persian aristocracy as distinctly odd. Kings who hide from their own nobility tend to make those nobles wonder what exactly is being hidden. The man who first grew genuinely suspicious was a prominent nobleman named Otanes, and the way he confirmed his hunch is one of the cleverest pieces of detective work in the whole account, hinging on a small, almost forgotten detail. Otanes recalled that some time earlier, the Magus brother now suspected of sitting on the throne had been punished by Cyrus for an offence by having his ears removed, a permanent and unmistakable mark. The real Smerdis, by contrast, had possessed a perfectly intact pair of ears. Now, Otanes happened to have a daughter named Fidim, who was one of the wives in the royal household, and therefore had access to the king in his most private moments. Otanes sent his daughter a secret message with a delicate and frankly nerve-wracking assignment. The next time she was with the sleeping king, she was to quietly feel for his ears and report back whether they were there. Fidim, understandably terrified, pointed out that if the man really was the Earless Magus, he would surely notice her investigating his head and have her killed on the spot, but she steeled herself and carried out the task. While the king slept, she carefully reached out and discovered that he had no ears at all. The man ruling the entire Persian Empire was indeed the disfigured impostor, exactly as suspected, exposed at last by a brave woman feeling around in the dark for a pair of ears that were not there. With the truth confirmed, Otanes gathered a small group of the most trusted and powerful Persian noblemen, and the conspiracy grew to a band of 7. Among them was a man who would become the central figure of everything that followed, a member of a noble Persian family and a distant relative of the royal line named Darius. The 7 debated their dangerous plan, and Darius, characterized throughout as bold to the point of recklessness, pushed hard for immediate action, arguing that delay only multiplied the risk of betrayal. They resolved to strike at once, and they forced their way into the palace and confronted the 2 Magi brothers. In the violent struggle that followed, the conspirators overcame the impostors and ended the brief reign of the false Smerdis, and the Persians afterward commemorated the event with such relief that they reportedly held an annual celebration marking the day the rule of the Magi was overthrown, a holiday on which members of that priestly class were wise to stay indoors. But killing the impostor left an enormous question wide open, namely who should now rule the empire, and here our investigator gives us one of the most remarkable passages in the entire history, a genuine debate among the 7 conspirators about what form of government Persia ought to adopt. It is a startling thing to find in a work this old, a serious discussion of political philosophy conducted by men who had just seized control of the largest empire on earth and could choose to organise it however they pleased. Otanes, the man who had uncovered the deception, argued passionately against placing power in any single individual. He pointed to the recent example of Cambyses and the impostor as proof that absolute power corrupts, and that even a good man, given unlimited authority and no accountability, eventually grows arrogant and cruel. He proposed instead that the Persians govern themselves collectively, with offices chosen by lot, decisions made in common assembly, and rulers answerable to the people, an early and genuine argument for something like popular government. A second conspirator, named Megabyzus, agreed that one-man rule was dangerous, but found the idea of handing power to the common crowd equally alarming, arguing that the mob was ignorant, fickle, and even more reckless than any tyrant, like a river in flood that destroys without understanding what it is doing. He proposed instead that a small group of the best and wisest men should rule together, an oligarchy of the capable few. Then Darius spoke, and he made the case for monarchy, for the rule of a single excellent man. He argued that nothing could surpass the government of one truly outstanding individual. That rule by the few inevitably collapsed into bitter rivalries and factional feuds, and that rule by the many bred corruption and cliques that were just as bad. A single strong ruler, he contended, could act decisively and keep the empire united, and he added the practical observation that the Persians had become great under kings and should not lightly abandon a system that had served them so well. In the end, 4 of the 7 sided with Darius, and monarchy carried the day. Otanes, having lost the argument, gracefully withdrew from the contest for the throne, asking only that he and his descendants be exempt from being ruled, a request that was granted, leaving his family uniquely free among the Persian nobility, which is a fairly elegant consolation prize for losing a debate about democracy. So the throne was to go to one of the remaining 6, and the method they chose to decide which one is so charmingly absurd that it could only be real. They agreed to meet on horseback at dawn outside the city, and whichever man's horse neighed first after sunrise would become king, leaving the choice, in theory, to the will of the gods and the whims of livestock. Darius, however, was not a man to leave his destiny to a horse's mood. He had a clever and devoted groom named Ubaraz, who quietly arranged for Darius's stallion to be very, very interested in being at that particular spot at dawn, through a bit of equine manipulation involving a mare the night before. When the 6 riders assembled at sunrise, Darius's horse, recalling the previous evening's encounter, let out an enthusiastic neigh before any other, and the matter was settled. Darius was hailed as the new king of kings, and a thunderclap conveniently rolled across the sky at that exact moment, which everyone took as the gods endorsing the result rather than questioning the suspicious behaviour of one particular horse. And so, an empire passed to a man through a combination of political cunning, a philosophical debate, and one extremely well-timed horse, which is about as Persian a path to the throne as one could imagine. Darius turned out to be a ruler of an entirely different stamp from his predecessors, less a conqueror in the mould of Cyrus or a madman in the mould of Cambyses, and more an administrator, an organiser, the kind of person who looks at a sprawling, chaotic empire and immediately reaches for a filing system. His great innovation was to divide the entire realm into a set of provinces, each governed by an official called a satrap, and to assign each province a fixed amount of tribute it had to pay into the royal treasury every year. Before Darius, taxation had been a haphazard business of irregular gifts and demands. After him, it was a regular, predictable system, which earned him a faintly mocking nickname among the Persians, who supposedly called him the shopkeeper because of his obsession with revenue and accounts. It is a telling detail that a people who admired conquerors regarded careful financial management as slightly beneath the dignity of a warrior king, even as that management was precisely what held the whole enormous structure together. What makes this dry topic of tribute genuinely delightful is the way our investigator uses it as a tour of the very edges of the known world, because each province paid in whatever exotic goods it produced, and the more distant the province, the stranger the goods. The lands of India, sitting at the eastern rim of everything the Persians knew, paid an enormous tribute in gold, and the explanation he was given for where all this gold came from is one of the most famous tall tales in his entire work. He reported with the careful air of a man relaying what he's been told rather than what he has confirmed, that in a certain Indian desert there lived enormous ants, creatures larger than a fox though smaller than a dog, which dug their burrows in sand that was rich with gold dust. As these giant ants threw up the sand while digging, the Indians would sneak in to gather the gold-laden earth, then flee at top speed on the fastest camels they had, because the ants, if they noticed the theft, would pursue the robbers and were apparently quite deadly when annoyed. Modern readers have long suspected that the kernel of truth here involves a type of large burrowing marmot found in the high mountains of that region, animals that do throw up earth that can contain mineral traces, and that the word for the creature got muddled in translation into the word for ant. Whatever the origin, the image of prospectors racing camels away from a swarm of furious gold-digging giant ants is the kind of thing you simply cannot make up, except that someone clearly did. Arabia, at the southern edge, supplied precious aromatics, and here the stories grew even more fantastical, which our investigator again relayed with his trademark mixture of fascination and skepticism. He explained that the Arabians harvested frankincense from trees that were guarded by small-winged serpents, brightly coloured flying snakes that clustered around the trees in great numbers, so that the gatherers had to drive them off with smoke before they could collect the fragrant resin. The collection of cassia, another aromatic spice, required wrapping oneself in protective hides, because the marshes where it grew were infested with fierce winged creatures resembling bats that would attack any harvester. And the gathering of cinnamon was the strangest of all. He reported that large birds carried the cinnamon sticks up to their nests built high on inaccessible cliffs, and that to obtain it, the Arabians would leave out large chunks of meat from slaughtered animals, which the birds would carry up to their nests, whereupon the weight of the meat would cause the nests to break and tumble down the cliff, dropping the precious cinnamon to the ground where it could be collected. It is a magnificent piece of nonsense, and to his credit he often signalled that he found these tales hard to swallow, recording them as the explanations he was offered, rather than facts he vouched for. The man simply could not resist a good story about the strange edges of the world, even when his own better judgment was raising an eyebrow. For all his administrative genius, Darius was still a king who ruled through fear as much as through paperwork, and his power was tested in ways that revealed both his ruthlessness and the strange dramas that played out around any throne. One of the original 7 conspirators, a man named Interfernes, ran afoul of the new king. Believing himself entitled, as one of the men who had put Darius on the throne, to walk into the royal presence whenever he wished, he was rebuffed by the guards, and in his fury he assaulted them, an offence Darius could not overlook from a man powerful enough to have been a co-conspirator. Suspecting that Interfernes and his family might be plotting against him, Darius ordered the arrest of the man along with his sons and close male relatives, all of them condemned to die. And here unfolds one of the most poignant and thought-provoking episodes in the whole work. The wife of Interfernes came to the palace gates and wept and pleaded so persistently for mercy that Darius, moved by her grief, decided to grant her a single concession. He would spare the life of just one of the condemned men, and she could choose which one. It was a cruel kind of mercy, forcing a woman to select a single member of her family to save while the rest perished. But the choice she made astonished everyone. She chose neither her husband nor any of her sons. She chose her brother. When the baffled Darius sent to ask why she had passed over her own husband and children in favour of a sibling, she gave an answer that has been pondered ever since. She explained that she could, if fate allowed, find another husband and bear other children, replacing what she had lost. But since both her mother and father were already dead, she could never under any circumstances gain another brother, and so, given the impossible choice, she saved the one family member who could never be replaced. Darius was so struck and pleased by the cleverness and the logic of her reasoning that he relented further, sparing not only her brother but also her eldest son, a small softening of an otherwise merciless verdict. It is a haunting little parable about the irreplaceability of certain bonds and the kind of moral puzzle that lodges in the mind and refuses to leave. A far greater challenge to Darius's authority came from the city of Babylon, which we last saw being captured by Cyrus through the diverted river. The Babylonians, chafing under Persian rule, rose in revolt and shut their mighty gates, preparing for a long siege behind those famously impregnable walls, and they were so confident of their ability to hold out that they reportedly taunted the Persians with the boast that the city would only fall when mules gave birth, which they considered a comfortable impossibility. Darius besieged the place for a long and frustrating time without success, the great walls defeating him just as they had defeated would-be conquerors before. The deadlock was eventually broken not by force, but by one of the most extraordinary acts of personal sacrifice in the entire history, carried out by a devoted Persian nobleman named Zopyrus. Zopyrus devised a plan so drastic that it is genuinely difficult to read about. To win the absolute trust of the Babylonians, he deliberately and severely disfigured his own body, inflicting grievous wounds upon himself, and then presented himself at the gates of Babylon as a victim of Darius's cruelty, claiming that his own king had mutilated him as punishment, and that he had therefore deserted to the Babylonian side, burning with desire for revenge. The Babylonians, seeing a high-ranking Persian nobleman so terribly maimed and apparently turned against his master, believed his story completely, for who would do such a thing to himself? They welcomed him, gave him command of their forces, and trusted him entirely. Over time, working according to a secret arrangement he had made with Darius beforehand, Zopyrus led the Babylonians out on engagements carefully designed to make him look like a brilliant defender. with Darius sacrificing expendable troops to build up his false hero's reputation. Once Zopyrus had risen to a position of total command and trust within the city, he simply opened the gates and let the Persian army pour in. Babylon fell a second time, undone by a man who had mutilated himself to become the perfect spy. Darius is said to have valued this act of devotion enormously, declaring that he would rather have one Zopyrus whole than 20 more conquered Babylons, though one suspects Zopyrus might have preferred a less painful way of earning the king's gratitude. Threaded through this period is a quieter storyline that our account weaves in, one whose consequences would dwarf all the rest, and it begins with a Greek doctor and a powerful queen. Among the people swept up into the Persian court was a brilliant physician from a Greek city, a man named Democedes, widely regarded as the finest doctor of his age, who had ended up at the Persian court more or less as a captive. His chance to rise came when Darius suffered a serious injury to his foot, twisting his ankle badly during a hunt, and the Persian physicians only made it worse with their rough treatment. Democedes, with his superior Greek medical knowledge, healed the king's foot with skill and gentleness, and his reputation was made overnight. He soon performed a second cure on someone even more important, the Queen Atossa, who was a daughter of the great Cyrus and a wife of Darius, and who therefore held immense influence at court. Atossa was suffering from a painful ailment that she had concealed out of embarrassment, and Democedes, agreeing to cure her on the condition that she would later grant him a favour in return, healed her as well, putting the most powerful woman in the empire in his debt. The favour Democedes wanted was, of course, to go home, and he engineered it through a piece of strategic whispering that would echo for generations. He persuaded Atossa to use her considerable influence over Darius by suggesting to the king, in private, that a great ruler such as himself ought to undertake a magnificent new conquest to prove his vigour and win glory, and that the lands of the Greeks to the west, with their skilled and beautiful people, would make a worthy target. Atossa, charmed by the idea and perhaps eager to acquire Greek attendants of her own, planted this notion in Darius's mind. Darius agreed first to send a scouting expedition westward to gather intelligence on Greece, and he sent Democedes along as a guide, which was exactly what the clever doctor had been angling for, since it gave him the chance to slip away and return to his Greek homeland during the journey, leaving the Persians short one physician and the empire newly fixated on the west. In this small, almost domestic intrigue, a doctor's homesickness and a queen's pillow talk lay the first seed of the colossal war between Persia and Greece that would eventually consume them both. The Persian gaze had turned westward, and it would not turn back. But before that western storm could break, Darius set his sights in the opposite direction entirely, northward, against a people who would humble even the great organizer in a way no walled city or rival king ever could. These were the Scythians, the fierce nomads who roamed the vast grasslands north of the Black Sea, and Darius nursed a grudge against them, supposedly to avenge an ancient invasion in which the Scythians had once swept down and dominated parts of Asia generations before. Whatever the true motive, he assembled an enormous army and prepared to march north across the great river the Greeks called the Ister, the mighty Danube, into the open steppe. To get his army across the river, he relied on the Greek cities of the coast that were under his control, whose rulers built him a great bridge of boats and were then left to guard it while the main army pushed on. That bridge, and the question of whether it would still be standing when he returned, would turn out to be the difference between survival and annihilation. The Scythians were unlike any enemy the Persians had faced, and our investigator takes the opportunity to describe their world and their ways in rich detail, because they were the very embodiment of a people shaped by their landscape. They had no cities and no farms to speak of. They lived on the move, dwelling in wagons, herding their animals across an endless ocean of grass, carrying their homes with them. This was the key to everything that followed, the strategic fact that made them nearly impossible to defeat. An army that has no fixed cities to capture, no fields to burn, no fortified capital to besiege, simply cannot be beaten in the conventional way, because there is nothing to take. You cannot conquer people who can pack up their entire civilization and ride away over the horizon faster than you can chase them. The Scythians understood this perfectly, and they built their entire defence around it. Their way of life struck the Greek imagination as wild and alien in equal measure, and our investigator recorded their habits with his usual appetite for the unfamiliar. They drank the milk of their mares and lived close to their horses in every sense, since a people who fought and travelled on horseback naturally built their whole existence around the animal. They worshipped their own gods under their own names, swore their oaths in their own fashion, and honoured their dead kings with enormous burial mounds heaped high over the grave, the very ancestral tombs that, as their king had pointed out, were the one thing on earth worth fighting to protect. One custom in particular caught his attention, a practice that sounds startlingly familiar to modern ears. After a funeral, the Scythians would purify themselves not with water, but with smoke, setting up a small tent, heating stones inside it, and then throwing the seeds of a certain plant onto the hot stones, which produced a thick vapour that filled the enclosed space. The Scythians would sit inside breathing this fragrant smoke and, in his words, howl with delight at the experience, emerging thoroughly content. He presented it as a method of ritual cleansing, though a modern reader might gently observe that the Scythians appear to have discovered the recreational potential of their cleaning routine some time ago. It was, in any case, one more entry in his vast catalogue of the wonderfully various ways that human beings have found to be human. When Darius and his great host arrived expecting a war, the Scythians flatly refused to give him one, at least not the kind he wanted. They would not submit, and they would not line up for a pitched battle where Persian numbers and discipline might prevail. Instead, they adopted a strategy of pure, maddening evasion. They split their forces and retreated steadily before the advancing Persians, always staying just out of reach, drawing the huge army deeper and deeper into the empty interior. As they withdrew, they practiced what we would now call scorched earth tactics, filling in the wells and springs along the route, destroying the grass and fodder, and leaving nothing behind but emptiness, so that the Persians advanced through an increasingly barren land with their supplies dwindling and no enemy to fight. Occasionally the Scythian cavalry would dart in, harass the Persian foragers, and then vanish again before any real engagement could develop, the ancient equivalent of a hit-and-run that left the lumbering invader swinging at empty air. Darius found himself marching ever onward in pursuit of an enemy who refused to be caught, burning through his provisions, chasing ghosts across the grass. Eventually, his patience exhausted and his army worn thin, Darius sent a message to the Scythian king, a leader named Idanthyrsus, essentially demanding that he stop running. The message challenged him either to stand and fight like a proper opponent if he believed himself strong enough, or, if he knew himself to be weaker, to stop fleeing and come offer the traditional tokens of submission, earth and water, and acknowledge Darius as his master. The reply Idanthyrsus sent back is a small masterpiece of defiance. He explained that the Scythians were not fleeing out of fear because they had nothing to flee from. They had no cities for the Persians to threaten, and no cultivated land for the Persians to ravage, so there was simply nothing at stake that would compel them to risk a battle. They lived as they always had, moving freely, and they saw no reason to fight a war over territory they did not value the way settled people did. There was, however, one thing that would make them fight. If the Persians could find and desecrate the tombs of the Scythian ancestors, the sacred burial mounds of their forefathers, then they would discover whether the Scythians would stand and fight or not. Short of that, Idanthyrsus suggested, Darius could keep marching around the empty steppe for as long as he liked. It was a brilliant answer, locating the one fixed and precious thing in a culture that otherwise owned nothing a conqueror could seize, and daring him to go find it in the trackless vastness, which of course he never could. The Scythians had one more message for Darius, and it came not in words but in the form of a strange and cryptic gift, the sort of riddle that ancient peoples loved to exchange. They sent him a bird, a mouse, a frog, and a bundle of arrows, with no explanation whatsoever, leaving the Persians to puzzle out the meaning. Darius, in his optimism, chose to interpret the gift as a token of surrender, reasoning that the mouse represented the land, the frog the water, the bird the swiftness with which the Scythians would flee, or perhaps their horses, and the arrows their weapons being handed over, so that the whole thing meant the Scythians were giving up their land, water, and arms. But one of his shrewder advisers read it the opposite way, and far more accurately. The true message, he argued, was a threat. Unless the Persians could fly up into the sky like the bird, or burrow into the earth like the mouse, or leap into the water like the frog, they would never escape the Scythian arrows, and they would all perish in that land. It was, in other words, a warning wrapped in a zoological puzzle, and the gloomier interpretation proved correct. The Scythians were not surrendering. They were promising that the Persians would never leave the steppe alive unless they turned around immediately, Darius, at last grasping the hopelessness of his position, surrounded by emptiness with his army starving and an uncatchable enemy promising his destruction, made the only sensible decision available and began a difficult retreat back toward the river and the bridge that was his only way home. And here the campaign reached its true moment of crisis, because the Scythians, far more mobile than the encumbered Persian host, raced ahead and reached the bridge over the Danube first, where the Greek rulers from the coastal cities had been left on guard. The Scythians urged these Greeks to do the obvious thing, to destroy the bridge and abandon Darius and his exhausted army, to die trapped on the wrong side of the river, which would have ended Persian power in one stroke and freed the Greek cities from their overlord. It was a golden opportunity, perhaps the single best chance the Greek world would ever have to be rid of the Persian threat before it grew truly dangerous, and it was sitting right there for the taking. But the Greek rulers guarding the bridge were not ordinary citizens. They were tyrants, men who held power in their home cities only because Persian backing kept them in their positions, and a clever speaker among them, a man named Histiaeus, pointed out the uncomfortable truth to his colleagues. If Darius fell and Persian power collapsed, then every one of them would lose the Persian support that propped up their unpopular rule, and their own people would promptly throw them out or worse. Their personal power was bound up with Darius's survival, so motivated by naked self-interest dressed up as loyalty, the tyrants decided to save the bridge and the king. They performed a cunning piece of theatre for the watching Scythians, pretending to begin dismantling the bridge by breaking up the section nearest the Scythian bank, persuading the nomads that they were complying. Satisfied, the Scythians rode off to find and finish the Persians. But the bridge remained essentially intact, and when Darius and his battered army finally staggered to the riverbank, they found their crossing waiting for them and escaped to safety, snatched from total disaster by the selfishness of a handful of Greek strongmen protecting their own positions. The Scythians, who had missed their chance to destroy Darius because of this deception, came away from the whole affair with a thoroughly contemptuous opinion of the Greeks. They concluded that, judged as free men, the Greeks were the most cowardly and worthless on earth, men who had been handed the perfect opportunity to win their own freedom, and had thrown it away to protect their masters, whereas judged as slaves, those same Greeks were the most devoted and unlikely to run away that one could find. It was a stinging verdict, and not an entirely unfair one regarding the bridge-guarding tyrants, though it lumped a whole people together based on the behaviour of a few self-serving rulers. Darius, for his part, had learned a hard lesson about the limits of even the greatest army when faced with an enemy that refuses to hold still, escaping with his life but with his aura of invincibility badly dented by a people who had beaten him without ever fighting a real battle. Though the Scythian adventure had failed, Darius was not willing to come away from the northern frontier entirely empty-handed, so on his return he left behind a capable general named Megabazus with a substantial force and orders to subdue the region of Thrace, the lands lying to the north of the Greek world, bringing those territories under Persian control and extending the empire's reach right up to the doorstep of Greece itself. This is the moment the Persian shadow first fell directly across the threshold of the Greek lands, the conquest of Thrace placing Persian power in immediate contact with peoples the Greeks regarded as their neighbours, and it set the stage for everything that was to come. It was in the course of this Thracian expansion that the Persians had their first memorable and humiliating brush with the kingdom of Macedon. In an episode that perfectly captures the collision of cultures about to unfold, Persian envoys arrived at the Macedonian court demanding the tokens of submission, and they were received with a lavish banquet. But the Persian ambassadors, deep in their cups and behaving with the arrogance of men who assumed everyone around them was already a subject, began to demand the company of the Macedonian women at the feast, treating their hosts with grossly insulting familiarity in a way that violated every standard of proper conduct. The Macedonian king's son, a sharp young prince named Alexander, watched this disgraceful behaviour with mounting anger and devised a clever and decisive response. He politely suggested the women withdraw to bathe and return more presentable, and during their absence he substituted for the women a group of beardless young Macedonian men, dressed in women's clothing and each concealing a dagger beneath the garments. When these disguised men took their places beside the leering, drunken Persian envoys, the ambassadors reached out to paw at what they took to be the local women, and the young men drew their hidden blades and dealt with the insolent guests once and for all. The arrogant Persian embassy simply vanished, quietly made to disappear so thoroughly that a later Persian investigation into the missing envoys had to be smoothed over with bribes and a diplomatic marriage to keep the matter from escalating. It is a fitting note on which to leave this chapter of the story, because it captures in miniature the larger drama now gathering force. The Persian Empire, vast and confident and accustomed to having every people bow before it, was beginning to press directly against a Greek world that was smaller, fractious, and far less impressed by Persian grandeur than the Persians expected anyone to be. The nomads of the steppe had shown that the great empire could be thwarted by those who refused to play by its rules, and now the Greeks, in their own prickly and unpredictable way, were starting to push back as well. The administrative king who had organised the world into tidy provinces and fixed tributes was discovering that not everyone could be filed neatly into a column of accounts, and that the people to his west in particular were going to be a great deal more trouble than a ledger could ever capture. The seed that the homesick doctor and the influential queen had planted was beginning to sprout, and the long collision between two utterly different visions of how the world should work was about to begin in earnest. The great collision did not begin with a grand declaration or a clash of mighty kings, but with the wounded pride and tangled ambitions of a few restless men in a single Greek city, which is so often how enormous catastrophes actually start. The city was Miletus, the wealthiest and most prominent of the Greek communities on the coast of Asia Minor that had fallen under Persian control, and the man at the centre of it was its ruler, a clever and ambitious figure named Aristagoras. Like the Greek strongmen who had guarded Darius's bridge over the Danube, Aristagoras held his position only with Persian blessing, governing his city as a deputy of the empire. He was, in other words, exactly the sort of locally powerful man whose authority rested on a foreign king's goodwill, and that arrangement, comfortable as it was, contained the seeds of its own undoing the moment his ambitions outran his luck. Aristagoras had talked the Persians into backing a military venture to seize a nearby island, promising them an easy conquest, and when the expedition turned into an embarrassing failure, he found himself in a deeply uncomfortable position. He had wasted Persian resources, fallen out with the Persian commander, and now feared he would be stripped of his power or worse once the bill for his failure came due. A man in that situation has limited options, and Aristagoras settled on the boldest and most reckless one available. Rather than wait to be punished, he would flip the entire board over. He would turn against the very empire that had made him, raising the Greek cities of the coast in open revolt against Persian rule, and recasting himself, conveniently, from a failed schemer into a champion of Greek freedom. It was a spectacular pivot from self-serving collaborator to liberty's defender, executed with the smoothness of a man who had run out of better ideas. He was not entirely alone in stirring this pot, and here the story takes a turn so strange it has delighted readers ever since. Back at the Persian court there was another Milesian, a man named Histiaeus, who had previously ruled Miletus himself before Darius, made nervous by his cleverness, had effectively detained him at the royal court under the polite fiction of keeping a valued advisor close. Histiaeus was bored, frustrated, and desperate to get back to the action on the coast, and he calculated that if a revolt broke out, Darius would have to send him back west to help suppress it. So he wanted to encourage Aristagoras to rebel, but he faced an obvious problem. Any message he sent could be intercepted and read by the suspicious Persians, and a letter urging revolt would have been a death sentence. His solution was gloriously, absurdly low-tech. He took a trusted servant, shaved the man's head completely bald, and then tattooed his secret message directly onto the bare scalp. He then waited for the hair to grow back, covering the message entirely, and sent the servant off to Aristagoras with instructions to tell him to shave the man's head and read what was written there. The message, once the scalp was exposed again, was a single instruction, an urging to rise up in rebellion. It is, without question, the most committed approach to secure messaging in the ancient world, the kind of plan that works beautifully as long as nobody is in a hurry, since waiting for an entire head of hair to regrow is not exactly express delivery. With Histiaeus secretly egging him on, and his own neck on the line, Aristagoras committed fully to the revolt, and he understood immediately that the scattered Greek cities of the coast could not hope to defeat the Persian Empire on their own. They needed allies, and the most powerful military force in the entire Greek world lived across the sea on the mainland, in a city famous above all others for its soldiers. So Aristagoras sailed to Sparta to make his pitch in person to the Spartan king, a stern figure named Cleomenes. He brought with him a remarkable object, a bronze map of the known world engraved on a tablet, one of the earliest world maps anyone had attempted, showing the whole circuit of the earth with all its seas and rivers laid out in metal, and he used it to walk the Spartan king through his argument, pointing out the rich Persian lands ripe for plundering, and the relative ease, as he painted it, of marching inland to strike at the heart of the empire and seize its fabulous wealth. He pointed from province to province along the tablet, naming the soft and wealthy peoples in between, and making the whole conquest sound like a pleasant stroll from one treasure house to the next, the kind of sales pitch that always glosses over the inconvenient details, such as distance. Cleomenes listened, and he was tempted by the talk of riches, but he was also a careful man, and he asked the one practical question that Aristagoras had been hoping to avoid. He asked how many days it would take to march from the coast where they would land all the way inland to the Persian capital where all that gold was kept. Aristagoras, in a rare moment of honesty that cost him everything, admitted that the journey would take about 3 months. The Spartan king reacted to this with the immediate horror of a man who has just understood the scale of what was being proposed. The idea of marching his soldiers a 3-month journey away from the sea and from home, deep into the heart of a hostile empire, struck him as pure madness, and he ordered Aristagoras to leave Sparta before sundown. There is a famous footnote to this rejection, involving the Spartan king's young daughter, who was present during a later, more private attempt by Aristagoras to bribe Cleomenes, and who reportedly warned her father to send the stranger away before the foreigner's escalating offers of money corrupted him, a piece of childhood wisdom that supposedly settled the matter. Sparta, the mightiest military power in Greece, wanted nothing to do with a war that would drag its army to the far end of the world. Rebuffed by the Spartans, Aristagoras turned to the other rising power of the Greek mainland, the city of Athens, and there he found a far warmer reception, with consequences that would echo for the rest of this story. The Athenians, a younger and more impulsive democracy, felt a kinship with their fellow Greeks suffering under Persian rule, and they were persuaded to lend their support to the cause. They sent a force of 20 ships to aid the rebellion, and a smaller neighbouring city added a few more. It does not sound like much, 20 ships, a modest contribution by any measure, but our investigator marks this decision as a pivotal hinge of history, observing that these vessels proved to be the beginning of great troubles for both the Greeks and the foreigners alike. A relatively small gesture of solidarity, 20 ships sent across the sea to help some distant cousins, would end up provoking the wrath of the greatest empire on earth and dragging the entire Greek world into a war for its survival. Few decisions in history have returned such an outsized and unexpected harvest of consequences from such modest seed. In the year 498 before the Common Era, the combined rebel forces, stiffened by their new Athenian and allied Greek reinforcements, marched inland and struck at the very symbol of Persian authority in the region, the great city of Sardis, the former capital of Golden Crucis that had long since become the seat of the local Persian governor. The rebels stormed into the city and, in the chaos of the assault, fire broke out, possibly started deliberately, possibly by accident among the reed-roofed houses, and the great city went up in flames. The Persian garrison held the citadel, but the city itself, including a temple sacred to a local goddess, burned. The destruction of Sardis was a tremendous symbolic blow, the burning of a major Persian provincial capital by a coalition of upstart Greeks, and word of it travelled fast across the empire all the way to the ears of King Darius. Darius, the great organiser, was reportedly less concerned about the rebellious coastal cities, which he was confident he could eventually crush, than he was about one specific detail in the reports. He wanted to know who exactly these Athenians were, these people from across the sea who had dared to send ships to help burn one of his cities, a people he had barely heard of and who had no business inserting themselves into his affairs. When he learned the answer, he was seized with a cold fury, and the story goes that he took a bow, shot an arrow high into the sky, and prayed to the heavens for the chance to take his revenge on Athens. He was so determined not to let the insult fade from his mind that he instructed one of his servants to repeat to him 3 times, every single day before dinner, a simple reminder to remember the Athenians. It is the ancient equivalent of setting a recurring daily alarm on your phone labelled "Do not forget to destroy Athens," a level of grudge-keeping that would be almost comical if it were not the prelude to decades of warfare. A lesser man might have let the insult fade with time, but Darius was nothing if not organised, and he filed his revenge away as carefully as he filed his tax records. The seed planted by the homesick doctor and the influential queen had now been thoroughly watered by a burning city, and the empire's full attention swung westward. For a time, the rebellion spread far beyond Miletus and burned brightly across a wide arc of the Persian frontier. The flame leapt across to the great island of Cyprus, whose Greek cities rose up as well, and it spread northward to the cities guarding the narrow straits that linked the seas, and southward into other coastal regions, until a broad swath of the empire's western edge was in open defiance. For a moment it must have looked as though the whole rim of the Persian world might tear itself loose. But a rebellion spread thin across many cities, each jealous of the others and reluctant to take orders, is a fragile thing, and the Persians were patient and methodical. They picked off the rebel regions one at a time, reconquering Cyprus, securing the straits, and tightening the noose around the heartland of the revolt, until the early blaze had been reduced to embers and finally to ash. The revolt itself, despite its dramatic early success, was ultimately doomed as a collection of fractious independent cities trying to resist a unified superpower generally is. The decisive blow fell at sea, in a great naval battle near a small island off the coast, where the combined fleet of the rebel Greek cities gathered to face the Persian navy, in a confrontation that would settle the fate of the whole uprising. Before the battle, command of training the Greek crews fell to a determined captain from one of the cities, a man who understood that discipline won sea battles, and who therefore drilled the rowers relentlessly under the brutal summer sun, day after day, rowing manoeuvres and ramming practice until the men were exhausted. The trouble was that these were proud, independent Greeks unaccustomed to being worked like slaves, and after a stretch of this punishing regimen they simply rebelled against their own trainer, refusing to take orders, lounging in the shade and declaring they would rather face the Persians unprepared than endure another day of his drilling. It is a painfully human moment, an army losing a battle before it began because the troops found the practice sessions too unpleasant, and when the fighting finally came, the lack of discipline showed. Worse, a large contingent from one of the islands had been secretly bargaining with the Persians and sailed away mid-battle, and their defection caused the whole rebel line to collapse. The Greek fleet was shattered, and with it the last real hope of the revolt. Over the following years, the Persians methodically reconquered the rebellious territories one by one, and the uprising collapsed entirely. Aristagoras, the man who had lit the fuse, did not live to see the end of it, having met his death while pursuing a venture in the north. Histiaeus, the architect of the tattooed message, eventually got his wish to return west, but his double-dealing caught up with him, and he too came to a bad end at Persian hands. Miletus, the proud city where it had all begun, was captured and harshly punished, its population devastated and scattered, its symbolic role as the cradle of the rebellion ensuring it received no mercy whatsoever. The fall of Miletus produced one of the most touching cultural footnotes in the entire account, one that shows how deeply the Greeks across the sea felt the loss of their kin. Not long afterward, a playwright in Athens composed and staged a tragic drama about the capture of Miletus, bringing the catastrophe to life on the stage before an Athenian audience. The effect was overwhelming. The theatre dissolved into weeping as the audience was confronted with the suffering of their fellow Greeks, and the Athenians were so distraught and so disturbed at being made to relive the disaster that they reacted in a rather unexpected way. They fined the playwright a substantial sum for reminding them of a calamity that struck so close to home, and they banned the play from ever being performed again. It is a remarkable early example of art proving too powerful for its own good, a tragedy so effective at evoking grief that the city essentially punished the author for doing his job too well. The Ionian revolt was over, the coastal Greeks were back under the Persian yoke, and by any normal reckoning the matter should have been closed. But Darius had made a promise to himself, repeated 3 times a day before dinner, and he had no intention of letting it go simply because the original revolt had been put down. Athens had to pay, and the only question left was how soon and how thoroughly. His first attempt to make good on that promise, however, ran headlong into the one obstacle that no army, however large, can overcome, which is the weather. A Persian expedition was sent westward under the command of one of Darius's relatives, a general named Mardonius, with the goal of bringing the Greek lands to heel and punishing those who had defied the empire. The land forces made some progress through the northern regions, but the accompanying fleet sailing along the coast met with catastrophe when it attempted to round a treacherous mountainous headland called Athos, a promontory notorious for its violent and sudden storms. A tremendous tempest blew up and smashed the fleet against the rocky coast, destroying, by the account, around 300 ships and drowning thousands upon thousands of men in a single disaster. The expedition was wrecked before it could accomplish its purpose, forced to turn back, and Darius's first swing at vengeance dissolved into the sea off a stormy cape. Even the mightiest empire on earth, it turns out, cannot issue orders to the wind, a lesson the Persians would have to learn more than once. Undeterred, Darius prepared a second expedition, and this time he opted for a more direct approach, sending his force across the sea rather than around the dangerous northern coast, aiming it straight at Athens and the smaller city that had supported the revolt. In the year 490 before the Common Era, this Persian armada crossed the Aegean, subduing islands along the way, and eventually landed its army on the coast of Attica, the territory of Athens itself, at a place whose name would become immortal, a coastal plain called Marathon. The Persians, confident in their numbers and their long record of victories, disembarked and prepared to crush the impudent Athenians who had dared to meddle in imperial business. Travelling with the invasion force in a detail dripping with irony was the elderly former tyrant of Athens, a man who had been expelled years before and now hoped to be restored to power as a Persian puppet, riding along with the enemy in the expectation of being installed as ruler over his own former city. The Athenians, facing an invasion aimed directly at their homeland, marched out to meet the Persians at Marathon with a force that was significantly outnumbered, supported only by a contingent from one small but fiercely loyal neighbouring town, the Spartans having promised to come but being delayed by a religious festival that their strict laws would not allow them to interrupt, an obligation they took so seriously that they were willing to risk arriving after the battle was already decided. The appeal to Sparta produced one of the most celebrated feats of endurance in the ancient world. When the Persians landed, the Athenians dispatched a professional long-distance runner named Phidippides to race to Sparta and beg for immediate help, and this remarkable man is said to have covered the enormous distance, well over 100 miles of rough country, in roughly 2 days, which is a staggering athletic achievement even by modern standards, and was accomplished without so much as a pair of cushioned shoes. According to the story he later told, somewhere in the wild mountainous country during this desperate run, the runner encountered the god Pan, who called him by name and asked, somewhat plaintively, why the Athenians paid him no attention, despite his being well disposed toward them and having helped them in the past and intending to help them again. The grateful Athenians, after the dust settled, established a shrine to Pan in thanks, having apparently been guilted into proper worship by a deity who felt underappreciated. Whether one believes in a goat-legged god flagging down a runner in the mountains, or simply pictures an exhausted athlete pushing himself to the edge of hallucination over 2 days of non-stop running, the achievement itself remains astonishing. This run to Sparta, by the way, is the true historical kernel behind the modern foot race that bears the name of the battle, though the popular tale of a single messenger dashing from the battlefield to Athens to gasp out news of the victory and then dropping dead is a later embellishment that our investigator, sticking to the run to Sparta, never actually mentions. So the Athenians stood largely alone on the plain, gazing across at a Persian army that had conquered most of the known world. Among the Athenian commanders was a general named Miltiades, and he possessed a crucial advantage that had nothing to do with numbers. He had spent time among the Persians earlier in his life and understood how they fought, how they deployed their forces, and crucially, how to exploit the weaknesses in their formation. Knowledge of your enemy, it turns out, can be worth several thousand soldiers, and Miltiades had it in abundance. There was, however, a problem with the Athenian command structure that nearly cost them everything before a single spear was thrown. The Athenian army was led not by one general, but by 10, one from each of the city's tribal divisions, and they held supreme command in rotation, each man taking charge for a single day, which is a thoroughly democratic arrangement and a thoroughly terrible way to run a battle. The generals were split down the middle. Half of them, including Miltiades, wanted to attack at once, while the other half argued they should wait, perhaps for the Spartans, perhaps for a better moment, fearing that engaging such a superior force was suicidal. With the vote deadlocked 5-5, the decision fell to a separate senior official, the war leader, a man named Callimachus, who held a kind of casting vote. Miltiades took him aside and made an impassioned, urgent case, arguing that delay would breed division and fear among the Athenians and possibly tempt some towards surrender, while a bold strike now, while morale held, could win everything. He warned that the choice before Callimachus was nothing less than whether Athens would remain free or fall into slavery, and that the deciding voice was his. Callimachus was persuaded and cast his vote for battle, breaking the deadlock. The generals who supported attacking then reportedly handed their own days of command over to Miltiades so that he could direct the fight, though he wisely waited until his own scheduled day came around to actually launch the assault. A battle that helped save Greek freedom, in other words, came within a single official's vote of never being fought at all. For several days the two armies faced each other across the plain without engaging, the Athenians reluctant to charge a superior force, and the Persians waiting for a favourable moment. Miltiades, however, eventually saw or seized his opportunity, possibly when a portion of the Persian cavalry, their most dangerous arm, was absent or being loaded onto ships, and he resolved to attack. He arranged the Athenian line in an unconventional way, deliberately thinning out his centre while strengthening both wings, a formation that flew in the face of normal tactics. Then he ordered his men to advance across the plain toward the Persian host, and as they closed the final distance, the Athenians did something the Persians had rarely seen, charging the last stretch at a run to minimize the time spent exposed to the deadly Persian archers. The sight of a smaller force of heavily armoured Greek infantry sprinting toward them must have struck the Persians as either brave or insane, and possibly both. The clash that followed was, at its heart, a collision between two completely different ways of making war, and understanding the difference explains the lopsided result. The Greeks fought as heavy infantry, each man encased in bronze armour and helmet, carrying a large round shield and a long thrusting spear, and they fought shoulder to shoulder in a tight, disciplined block, every man's shield helping to protect the man beside him, advancing as a single bristling wall of metal. The Persians, masters of a different style suited to their vast and varied empire, relied heavily on mobility, on clouds of arrows loosed from a distance, and on lighter troops who wore little armour and carried wicker shields and shorter weapons, a force built for speed and for overwhelming lightly equipped opponents across open ground. In a long-range exchange of arrows, the Persians held every advantage, which is precisely why the Greeks ran the final stretch, closing the gap so fast that the archers had time for only a volley or two before the armoured wall crashed into them, and once the fighting became a close, grinding, shoving match of spear against wicker and bronze against cloth, the Greek advantages in armour, weapon length, and tight formation became overwhelming. The Persians were brave and numerous, but they were simply not equipped for the kind of brutal, up-close push-of-shields combat that the Greek style forced upon them. What followed vindicated Miltiades' unusual battle plan brilliantly. The strong Persian centre pushed back the deliberately weakened Greek middle, exactly as Miltiades had anticipated, and the Persians there pressed forward thinking they were winning. But the reinforced Greek wings overwhelmed the weaker Persian flanks, routing them, and then, instead of chasing the fleeing enemy, the victorious Greek wings wheeled inward and closed upon the advancing Persian centre from both sides, trapping the heart of the Persian army in a crushing envelopment. The Persian formation collapsed into chaos and panic, and the foreigners broke and fled in disorder back toward their ships beached on the shore, with the Greeks pursuing them across the plain and into the surf. The result was a stunning, almost unbelievable victory for the outnumbered Athenians. By the count our investigator records, the Persians lost around 6,400 men on that field, while the Athenians lost only 192. The lopsidedness of those numbers tells the whole story of how completely the Greek tactics and discipline had triumphed over Persian numbers, and the dead of Athens were honoured with a burial mound on the very plain where they fell, a monument to a day that the Greek world would never forget. Those graves still drew visitors centuries later, a quiet reminder of the morning a free city stood alone and won. Marathon was far more than a single battlefield success. It shattered the myth that the Persians were invincible, proving to the Greeks, and perhaps more importantly to themselves, that the soldiers of the great empire could be beaten, and beaten decisively, by free men fighting for their own land. The psychological impact of that revelation cannot be overstated, and it would steel Greek resolve for the far greater trials still to come. The hero of the hour, however, did not enjoy his glory for long, and his fate is a small but pointed reminder of the theme that has shadowed this entire story. That fortune lifts a man high, precisely so the fall has further to travel. Flush with the prestige of Marathon, Miltiades persuaded the Athenians to entrust him with a fleet for a new expedition, the purpose of which he kept deliberately vague, promising only to enrich the city. The campaign, against an island that had sided with the Persians, went badly. The siege failed, Miltiades suffered a serious injury to his leg, and he was forced to return home empty-handed, having spent the city's resources and delivered nothing. The grateful Athenians, who only recently had hailed him as their saviour, now turned on him with the speed of a democracy that does not forgive a wasted opportunity, putting him on trial and imposing an enormous fine. Before the matter was fully resolved, the wound in his leg festered and turned gangrenous, and the man who had outthought the Persian army and saved Athens died of his injury. His triumph curdled into disgrace within a year of the greatest victory of his life. Even the architect of Marathon, it turns out, was not exempt from the old lesson that no one should be called fortunate while there is still time for the wheel to turn. The defeated Persians sailed away. The planned restoration of the exiled tyrant came to nothing, and Athens, against every reasonable expectation, had thrown back the empire's punitive expedition and survived. For the moment, the impudent city had not only escaped destruction, but had won a victory that would ring through the centuries. There were a couple of intriguing loose ends that our investigator could not resist picking at. The Spartans, true to their word but bound by their festival, finally set out the moment their religious obligations allowed, and force-marched to Athens with impressive speed, only to arrive after everything was over. Rather than sulk about missing the fight, they reportedly asked to be taken to the battlefield so they could inspect the Persian dead for themselves, curious to see with their own eyes these foreigners who had been beaten, and they praised the Athenians for the job they had done before heading home. It is a strangely sporting gesture, a delegation of elite warriors showing up late and essentially asking for a tour of the victory they had missed. The other loose end was more sinister. As the Persian ships were pulling away, someone on the Greek side allegedly raised a polished shield to catch the sunlight and flash a signal out to the enemy fleet, apparently inviting them to sail around and attack the now undefended city of Athens while its army was still out at Marathon. Our investigator records the accusation that a prominent and powerful Athenian family was behind this act of attempted treachery. But he also, in his careful way, examines the charge and expresses his own doubts about whether that particular family would really have done such a thing, laying out the evidence and letting the reader weigh it. The shield was real enough, he concedes. Who flashed it, and why? He leaves as an unsolved mystery, which is a far more honest approach than simply picking a villain and moving on. Darius, when the news of Marathon reached him, did not take the defeat as a reason to abandon his quest, but rather as fuel to pursue it on an even grander scale. A mere punitive expedition had failed, so he resolved to gather the full might of his enormous empire and return to crush Greece utterly, no longer as a matter of revenge against a single city, but as a full imperial conquest. He spent the following years issuing commands across his vast dominions, summoning troops, ships, horses and supplies from every province, assembling the resources for an invasion on a scale the world had never seen. But the great king had set himself one final ambition too many, and time, the one enemy no monarch can outmaneuver, caught up with him before his preparations were complete. Darius died with his grand invasion still unrealized, his 3 times daily reminder about the Athenians left unfulfilled, passing the unfinished war and the enormous machinery of conquest he had assembled down to his son and heir. That son, raised in the expectation of avenging his father and finishing what generations of Persian kings had started, would inherit not just the throne but the grudge, and he would pursue it with a colossal ambition that would bring the long-building storm crashing down on Greece at last. Where his father had sent expeditions, this heir would summon the entire strength of a continent, gathering an army and fleet so vast that the very description of it would strain belief, and he would march it personally toward the small, divided, stubborn cities that had twice now defied the might of the East. The defeat at Marathon had not closed the account, it had merely deferred it, and the reckoning, when it came, would dwarf everything that had gone before. His name was Xerxes, and the greatest confrontation of the entire age was about to begin. The son who inherited his father's unfinished war was a man named Xerxes, and where his father had been the patient organizer who reached for a ledger, Xerxes reached for the largest hammer in human history and set about building it. He did not want a punitive raid or a modest expedition. He wanted to bring the entire weight of the Persian Empire down upon Greece in one overwhelming flood, to gather soldiers, sailors, horses, and supplies from every corner of his enormous dominions, and march them west in numbers so vast that resistance would seem absurd. According to the account, he spent years on the preparations, and the force he eventually assembled was so colossal that our investigator reached for almost cosmic comparisons to convey it, describing rivers supposedly drunk dry by the marching multitude, and a host that seemed to contain a sample of every people the empire ruled. Even allowing for the natural tendency of ancient writers to inflate enemy numbers into the realm of fantasy, the scale was genuinely staggering. An invasion meant not merely to defeat Greece, but to erase the very idea that anyone could defy the great king. The decision to launch this enormous undertaking did not come easily, and the account gives us a remarkable scene of debate at the Persian court that fits perfectly into the larger pattern of dreams and warnings that runs through this whole story. When Xerxes first proposed the invasion to his council, his trusted uncle and advisor, an older and wiser head named Artabanus, spoke up with a sober warning against the whole enterprise. He cautioned that overreaching ambition invited disaster, that the gods had a way of striking down whatever grew too great and proud, and that an expedition of such size carried enormous and unpredictable risks, the very lesson that had played out over and over with the proud rulers before. Xerxes was at first persuaded to abandon the plan, but then, the story goes, a mysterious figure appeared to him in a dream, a tall and imposing apparition that urged him not to give up the invasion, threatening ruin if he turned aside from his course. When the dream returned a second night, a shaken Xerxes had Artabanus himself sleep in the royal bed dressed in the king's robes, to test whether the vision was truly sent by the gods. The same figure duly appeared to Artabanus as well, rebuking him for trying to talk the king out of his destiny, and the old advisor, thoroughly unnerved, withdrew his objections. So the decision for war was sealed not by reason but by a dream that refused to be argued with. One more instance in which a higher power seemed to be steering events toward a conclusion no mortal could avoid, and which, as always in these tales, no one could quite read clearly until it was far too late. The single greatest engineering challenge facing this monstrous army was the water that separated Asia from Europe, a narrow but treacherous strait, and the way Xerxes dealt with it tells you everything about the man. He ordered his engineers to build an enormous bridge made of ships lashed together side by side across the channel, a roadway of boats over the open water, so that his army could simply walk from one continent to the next. It was an audacious feat, and it was promptly destroyed by a violent storm that smashed the whole construction apart, which any reasonable person might have taken as a sign that the sea had opinions about the project. Xerxes did not take it that way. In a fit of royal rage that has echoed down the centuries as the very image of tyrannical arrogance, he reportedly ordered that the strait itself be punished for its insolence. The water was to be given a set of lashes with a whip, a symbolic flogging of the sea, and some accounts add that fetters were thrown into it to chain it, while the unfortunate engineers who had built the failed bridge were beheaded for their trouble. It is worth pausing on the sheer theatrical absurdity of a man commanding his soldiers to whip the ocean as punishment, a gesture so disproportionate and so futile that it has served ever since as the perfect emblem of power untethered from sense. The sea, naturally, was unmoved by the flogging, but a second, sturdier bridge was eventually built, and the great army crossed. Xerxes had also learned at least one practical lesson from his father's failures. Recalling how an earlier Persian fleet had been smashed to splinters by a storm while trying to round the treacherous headland of Athos, the same disaster that had wrecked the first attempt at vengeance years before, Xerxes decided he would not give that murderous cape a second chance at his ships. So he ordered his men to dig a canal straight through the narrow neck of the peninsula, a waterway wide enough for warships to pass two abreast, allowing his navy to sail safely through the land rather than risk the open water around the point. It was a tremendous labour, with crews from many nations toiling for years to cut the channel, and our investigator notes with some amusement that Xerxes seems to have ordered it, partly out of genuine prudence and partly out of sheer ostentation, a desire to leave behind a monument to his own power, since a simpler overland portage would likely have served. Whatever the motive, it stands as another example of the great king bending the very landscape to his will, reshaping continents rather than accommodating them, which is a habit that tends to impress in the short term and bankrupt empires in the long one. Once in Europe, Xerxes wanted to know exactly how many men he commanded, and the method he supposedly used to count his uncountable army is one of those details that captures the impossible scale of the thing. Rather than attempting to tally individuals, he had a body of 10,000 men packed tightly together in a single spot, then drew a line around the space they occupied and built a low fence around that area. Then he simply marched the rest of the army through that same enclosure, batch after batch, filling and emptying the human-sized measuring pen over and over until the entire host had passed through, counting by the fenceful rather than by the head. It was essentially measuring an army by volume rather than by number, the way you might estimate a crowd by how many times you can refill a stadium, and it gives a vivid sense of a force too large for any normal accounting. He reviewed this measureless multitude on a great plain, surveying the sea of soldiers stretching to the horizon, and even amid his own confidence, the account has him reflecting with sudden melancholy that of all these countless men, not one would be alive in 100 years, a flash of the old wisdom about the brevity of human life surfacing even in the heart of the proudest expedition ever assembled. That flicker of reflection did not, unfortunately, translate into much mercy. There is a telling story from the march involving an immensely wealthy Lydian named Pythias, reputedly one of the richest men of the age, who entertained the king and his entire army with extravagant hospitality and even offered to contribute his vast fortune to fund the war effort, a gesture so generous that Xerxes, pleased, rewarded him warmly. But when Pythias, emboldened by this goodwill, made a single modest request, asking that the eldest of his 5 sons, all of whom were serving in the army, be excused from the campaign so that one of them might remain to care for his aging father, Xerxes flew into a rage at what he took as an insult to his expedition. The king's response was savage and entirely out of proportion to the request, a brutal demonstration that no one, however generous, was permitted even the smallest exemption from his will. It was the same lesson the flogged sea had taught, that this was a ruler who experienced any limit on his desires as an affront to be crushed, and it cast a chill over an army that was only beginning its march. As this vast tide rolled toward Greece, the Greek cities faced the terrifying question of how to resist it, and many simply did not, choosing submission over annihilation. But a coalition of the more defiant cities, with Sparta and Athens at its core, resolved to fight, and they settled on a strategy of holding the invaders at narrow places where the Persian advantage in numbers would count for less. The most famous of these choke points was a slender coastal pass where the mountains came down close to the sea, a place called Thermopylae, and it was here, in the year 480 before the Common Era, that one of the most celebrated stands in all of human history took place. The defence was led by one of the 2 kings of Sparta, a man named Leonidas, who took up position in the pass with a small force built around an elite corps of 300 Spartan warriors, supported by several thousand allied Greeks from various cities, perhaps 7,000 in all, a tiny force set against the immeasurable host bearing down on them. The choice of ground was everything. In the cramped confines of the pass, the Persians could not bring their overwhelming numbers to bear, forced instead to funnel their men into a narrow front where the heavily armoured Greek infantry, fighting in their tight disciplined formation, could hold against vastly greater numbers. For 2 full days the defenders held the pass, throwing back wave after wave of Persian assaults, including attacks by the elite troops the Persians considered their very best, inflicting heavy losses while suffering relatively few themselves. The narrowness of the ground turned the Persian advantage into a liability, and the Greeks fought with a discipline and resolve that left the great king, watching from a distance, increasingly frustrated and astonished that such a small band could defy his entire army. Before the fighting, there had been a revealing conversation that goes to the very heart of what this whole war was about. Travelling with Xerxes was an exiled former king of Sparta named Demaratus, who had fled to the Persian court and now served as an advisor on Greek affairs. Curious and confident, Xerxes asked him whether the Greeks would really dare to stand against such an overwhelming force, finding it hard to believe that a handful of free men would not simply flee at the sight of his numbers. Demaratus answered with a truth that the king could not quite grasp. He explained that the Spartans in particular would never submit, that they would fight no matter how hopeless the odds, because although they were free men, they were not free in every respect, for they had a master over them more fearsome than any king, and that master was their law. Their law commanded them never to flee from battle regardless of the enemy's numbers, but to stand firm and either conquer or die where they fought. Xerxes found this almost comical, unable to understand how men with no ruler standing over them with a whip could possibly fight harder than subjects driven into battle by fear of their king, and that, in a single exchange, is the philosophical core of the entire conflict. The collision between an empire built on the obedience of subjects to a single master and a scattering of cities whose citizens fought, willingly and to the death, for laws and a freedom that were their own. The events at the pass were about to prove which kind of man fought harder. There is a famous exchange from before the battle that captures the spirit of the Spartans perfectly. When Xerxes sent a demand that the Greeks surrender their weapons, Leonidas is said to have sent back a reply consisting of just 2 words, an invitation for the king to come and take them himself, a piece of laconic defiance so perfect it has been quoted ever since. And when a Greek was warned that the Persian archers were so numerous their arrows would blot out the sun, he reportedly responded that this was excellent news, since the Greeks would then get to fight in the shade. This dry, unflinching courage in the face of impossible odds is precisely what made the stand at Thermopylae immortal. A small group of men meeting overwhelming force with grim humour and absolute resolve. What the Greek position could not survive was betrayal, and betrayal duly arrived in the form of a local man named Ephialtes, whose name became a byword for treachery for all time. Hoping for a reward, this traitor went to the Persians and revealed the existence of a hidden mountain path that wound around the pass and emerged behind the Greek defenders, allowing the Persians to send a force to encircle them. When Leonidas learned that the Persians were coming around the secret trail, and that his position was about to be surrounded, he made a fateful decision. He dismissed most of the allied contingents, sending them away to fight another day, and remained in the pass with his 300 Spartans and a few others, who refused to abandon him, choosing to hold the line to the last and cover the retreat of the rest. The Spartans, bound by a code that did not permit retreat or surrender, fought on to the very end in a final desperate stand, and Leonidas and his men perished in the pass they had defended so heroically. Their sacrifice bought precious time and, more importantly, gave the Greek world a rallying symbol of free men willing to die rather than submit, a legend that would steel Greek courage through everything still to come. The pass was lost, but the story of how it was held became one of the most powerful pieces of inspiration any people ever possessed. While the land battle raged at the pass, a parallel struggle was unfolding at sea, where the allied Greek fleet sought to hold a nearby strait against the enormous Persian navy, and it is here that one of the most fascinating figures in the entire work takes the stage, a person of particular pride to our investigator. Her name was Artemisia, and she was the ruling queen of his own home city of Halicarnassus, which fought on the Persian side as a subject of the empire. Artemisia was the only woman commanding ships in the entire conflict, a female naval commander leading her vessels into battle alongside the men, and she distinguished herself not through reckless aggression, but through sharp intelligence and cool-headed judgment. Before the great naval confrontation, she alone among Xerxes' advisors reportedly had the nerve to counsel against giving battle in the cramped waters the Greeks had chosen, arguing presciently that the Persian fleet's size would become a handicap rather than an advantage in such confined conditions. Xerxes admired her boldness and her counsel, even though in this instance he chose not to follow it, and her clear-eyed strategic sense throughout the campaign earned the great king's genuine respect, a remarkable achievement for anyone, let alone a woman, in that world. The decisive sea battle came in the narrow waters near an island called Salamis, just off the coast near Athens, and it was engineered by the cunning of an Athenian leader named Themistocles, a man of extraordinary foresight who had spent years convincing his fellow Athenians to build a powerful navy precisely for a moment like this. Themistocles had earned his authority partly through a brilliant reading of an oracle, in an episode that brings the recurring theme of cryptic prophecy to its finest and most consequential moment. As the Persian host approached, the frightened Athenians had sent to the famous oracle for guidance, and they received a grim and frightening response, but tucked within it was the puzzling advice that a wall of wood would keep them safe. The people argued bitterly over what this could mean. Some insisted it referred to an old wooden palisade around the sacred hill at the centre of the city, and wanted to barricade themselves there. But Themistocles argued forcefully that the wooden wall meant their ships, their fleet of timber-hulled warships, and that the oracle was telling them to abandon the city itself and stake everything on a battle at sea. Unlike Golden Crusus, who had heard only what he wished to hear and marched to his ruin, Themistocles read the riddle correctly, and he persuaded the Athenians to make the agonizing choice to evacuate their entire city. They loaded their families onto ships and sent them to safety, leaving Athens empty, and when the Persians arrived they took the abandoned city and burned it, putting the sacred buildings to the torch. It was a devastating loss, the heart of Athens in flames, but it was a building emptied of its people, and the Athenians had wagered everything on the wooden walls of their fleet, exactly as the oracle, properly understood, had advised. Themistocles understood the same truth Artemisia had warned the Persians about, that the Persian fleet's overwhelming numbers would work against it in tight quarters, where there was no room to manoeuvre, and the sheer crowding of ships would breed chaos. The challenge was getting the cautious Greek allies, who wanted to retreat and defend their own home waters, to commit to fighting at Salamis. Themistocles solved this with a daring deception. He secretly sent a message to Xerxes, pretending to be a friend of the Persian cause, informing the king that the Greek fleet was divided and planning to slip away, and urging him to block the exits of the strait and trap them before they could escape. Xerxes, eager to finish the war in one decisive blow and trusting the false intelligence, took the bait. He moved his fleet to seal off the narrows, which had the effect of forcing the reluctant Greeks to stay and fight, exactly as Themistocles had schemed, while simultaneously cramming the enormous Persian navy into precisely the confined space where its numbers became a curse. When battle was joined in those tight waters, everything unfolded as the clever Athenian had foreseen. The huge Persian fleet, packed too densely into the narrow channel, lost all coherence, ships colliding with one another, unable to turn or retreat. The rear vessels pressing the front ones forward into a tangled mass, while the more manoeuvrable Greek ships struck at them with devastating effect. The sheer size that was supposed to guarantee Persian victory instead became the instrument of its destruction, the fleet smashing itself to pieces in the confined space. Xerxes, who had set up a throne on a hillside overlooking the strait expecting to watch a glorious triumph, instead witnessed the catastrophic ruin of his navy in real time, the most expensive front-row seat to a disaster in history. Amid the chaos, Artemisia performed a manoeuvre of such ruthless quick thinking that it became legendary, extracting her ship from a desperate situation through a bold and cold-blooded improvisation, and Xerxes, watching from his hill and misunderstanding what he had seen, reportedly remarked that his men had become women, and his women had become men, a backhanded tribute to the one commander who kept her head while his grand fleet fell apart. The defeat at Salamis broke the back of the invasion. With his navy shattered, Xerxes faced the alarming prospect that the victorious Greek fleet might sail to the bridge over the strait and destroy it, cutting off his line of retreat and stranding him in hostile Europe, a nightmare scenario that echoed the trap his own people had so narrowly escaped on the Scythian campaign generations before. Unnerved, the great king decided to return home with much of his army, leaving behind a powerful force under one of his most capable generals to finish the conquest the following year. The tide that had rolled in with such overwhelming confidence was beginning at last to ebb. In the anxious councils after the defeat, it was once again Artemisia whose advice the king sought and valued above the rest. While others may have urged him to press on, she counselled him to do exactly what he was inclined to do, to withdraw home with the bulk of the army and leave his general behind to continue the war, reasoning that if the campaign succeeded the credit would still be his, and if it failed the loss would fall on a subordinate rather than on the king himself. Xerxes was so pleased with her counsel, and so trusting of her judgment, that he gave her a singular honour, entrusting some of his own children to her care to be escorted safely back across the sea. It is a striking final note for the queen of our investigators' home city, the woman who had warned against the battle that wrecked the fleet, now the most trusted voice in the defeated king's circle, and the guardian of his royal children, a remarkable arc for the only female commander in the entire war. The final reckoning came in the year 479 before the Common Era, in two battles fought on the same campaign that together broke Persian power in Greece for good. On land, the Greek coalition, with the Spartans and Athenians again at the forefront, met the Persian army that had been left behind in a hard-fought engagement near a town called Plataea. After much manoeuvring and tension, the disciplined Greek heavy infantry once again proved its superiority in close combat, shattering the Persian force and killing its commanding general, ending the land threat decisively. There is a wonderful detail from the victory's aftermath that captures the whole clash of cultures in a single image. When the Greeks entered the captured Persian camp, the Spartan commander, a man named Pausanias, came upon the abandoned tent of the enemy general, fitted out with all the staggering luxury of Persian royalty, gold and silver couches, embroidered hangings, and tables groaning with elaborate delicacies prepared by a small army of cooks. Amused, Pausanias ordered his own servants to prepare a typical plain Spartan meal alongside the lavish Persian feast, and when the two were set side by side, the contrast was so absurd, the simple Spartan fare next to the gilded Persian banquet, that he laughed and called over the other Greek leaders to see it, remarking on the folly of the Persians who lived in such opulence yet had come all this way to rob the Greeks of their meagre black broth. It is a perfect, understated joke at the heart of the war. The richest empire on earth defeated by men who could not imagine why anyone would bother envying their dinner. At nearly the same time, according to tradition on the very same day, the Greek fleet won another major victory against the remaining Persian naval forces at a place called Mycale on the coast of Asia Minor. A triumph that not only destroyed Persian sea power, but also sparked a fresh wave of rebellion among the coastal Greek cities, who rose up once more against their imperial masters, this time with the mainland Greeks behind them. Between Plataea on land and Mycale at sea, the great invasion was finished, the immeasurable host that had set out to erase Greece scattered and broken, and the small, quarrelsome, fiercely independent Greek cities had, against all probability, preserved their freedom against the mightiest empire on earth. The question that had launched our investigators' entire inquiry, the question of why the Greeks and the Persians went to war and how the smaller power prevailed, had reached its astonishing answer. And here, with the Great War won, the circle of our story begins to close, returning at last to the man who gathered all these tales and the world that shaped him. The boy from Halicarnassus, who, as we know, grew up under Persian rule in the very city ruled by the remarkable Artemisia, did not spend his whole life merely collecting other people's stories. He lived inside his own age of upheaval. In time, his home city fell under the rule of a tyrant named Lygdamis, a grandson of that same warrior queen whose courage at sea he so admired, and our investigator became involved in the resistance against this oppressive ruler, taking part in the political struggle to break the tyrant's grip on the city. There is a certain poignancy in the fact that the same family line that produced the brilliant Artemisia, whom he praised so warmly, also produced the despot he risked everything to oppose. A reminder that history rarely sorts people into tidy heroes and villains. The effort to free his homeland did not go smoothly for him, and the upheaval eventually drove him into exile, sending the man who would chronicle the wandering of nations off on wanderings of his own. His travels, which we have followed through Egypt and Babylon, and the edges of the known world, were partly the journeys of a curious mind and partly the movements of a man without a settled home. Eventually his path led him westward to a brand new city being founded as a colony in the southern part of Italy, a fresh settlement called Thurii, drawing colonists from across the Greek world to build something new far from the old quarrels. It was here, in this frontier colony at the far end of the Greek world, that he is believed to have settled and completed his great work, assembling the lifetime of inquiry, the interviews and the measurements and the tall tales and the hard-won truths into the sprawling masterpiece that earned him his title as the father of the entire discipline of history. There is a cherished story about the impact of that work, one that beautifully links the man who invented the writing of history to the man who would refine it. According to the tradition, our investigator gave public readings of his history, reciting his accounts aloud to gathered audiences, as was the custom of the age. At one such reading, a young boy was present in the crowd, and he was so profoundly moved by what he heard, so stirred by the great sweep of the narrative and the drama of the rise and fall of kings and empires, that he was reduced to tears. The older historian, noticing the weeping youth, turned to the boy's father and remarked that his son's nature was burning with a passion for knowledge, that the boy had within him a hunger to learn and to understand. That tearful boy, the story goes, was Thucydides, who would grow up to become the next great historian of the Greek world, the man who would chronicle the terrible war between Athens and Sparta that came a generation later, carrying forward and sharpening the very craft of recording the human past that he had first encountered, weeping at a public reading. And so the circle closes exactly where it should. A child who grew up in the shadow of a great war, surrounded by adults endlessly retelling the stories of how the Greeks had thrown back the mightiest empire on earth, was so seized by the question of why people do these things to one another that he spent his entire life chasing the answer across the known world. He walked through the ruins of golden cities and the temples of Egypt, sat with priests and old soldiers, recorded the wisdom of Solon and the rage of Xerxes, the cleverness of queens and the folly of kings, the misread oracles and the inescapable turns of fortune that brought down the proud one after another. He preserved the giant gold-digging ants and the flogged sea and the brave dead of the narrow pass, the foolish and the wise alike, sorting what he believed from what he merely heard, and in doing so he handed down to every generation that followed a treasure of human memory that has now lasted more than 2,000 years. The questions he asked, about why we fight, about how fortune lifts us and casts us down, about the strange and wonderful variety of the ways people choose to live, are the same questions we're still asking tonight, which is perhaps the truest measure of what he accomplished. There is a fitting piece of wisdom that our investigator chose to place near the very end of his great work, a small story that gathers up the whole meaning of everything he had recorded. Back in the days of Cyrus, the founder of the empire we have followed from its rise to its humbling, some Persians had supposedly suggested that, having conquered so much of the world, they ought to leave their own rugged and difficult homeland and move to one of the rich, soft, comfortable lands they now ruled. Cyrus rejected the idea with a warning that proved prophetic across the generations. He told them that soft lands tend to breed soft men, that no country produces both luxurious comfort and hardy warriors, and that if the Persians wished to remain rulers rather than become the ruled, they had better stay in their harsh homeland and keep their edge. The Persians of Cyrus's day took the lesson to heart and chose to live hard and rule. But by the time of Xerxes, generations of conquest and wealth had done exactly what Cyrus feared, and the empire that flogged the sea and counted its soldiers by the fenceful had grown grand and proud and, in the crucial sense, soft, while the people they came to enslave still ate their black broth and fought for their own laws. The whole sweeping story, from the bedroom intrigue of a Lydian court to the burning of a great fleet in a narrow strait, turns on that single quiet truth about comfort and hardness, fortune and pride, and it is no accident that the man who gathered all these tales chose to leave us with it. The boy who cried at his reading went on to carry the torch, and the torch has never since gone out. That brings our long journey through the ancient world to its end. From a secret in a single bedroom all the way to the battle that decided the fate of a continent, all of it preserved by one endlessly curious man who simply refused to stop asking why. Thank you for travelling all this way with me, through golden Sardis and the walls of Babylon, down the Nile and across the empty steppe, to the narrow pass and the crowded strait where freedom made its stand. Now go ahead and let your eyes drift closed, settle into the quiet, and let these old stories carry you gently off. Good night to each and every one of you, and may your dreams be sweet.